He could buy entire city blocks before breakfast. She couldn't afford to fix the water pump that kept her animals alive. And the cruel joke of it all? His company had been quietly circling her land for 3 years, drawing up blueprints, calculating demolition costs, putting a dollar figure on the soil her father had bled into for 40 years. Then his car broke down on a road nobody uses anymore. She stopped. She helped him. She drove away not knowing she'd just looked into the eyes of the man planning to destroy everything she loved. This is that story. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer that nearly broke Ava Harper started the same way most of her summers did, with a list of things she couldn't afford and a cup of coffee she made too strong because the can was almost empty and she needed to stretch it another week. She sat at the kitchen table at 5:47 in the morning, the ceiling fan turning slow overhead, pushing hot air from one side of the room to the other without actually cooling anything. The kitchen smelled like old wood and motor oil, which was just the smell of the house now. It hadn't always been. When her father was alive, it had smelled like bacon and the particular brand of cheap soap he'd used every morning of his adult life. But Robert Harper had been gone 18 months, and grief changes a house in ways that are almost impossible to explain. Quietly, room by room, until one morning you look around and realize the place feels like a museum dedicated to someone who isn't coming back. Ava was 30 years old. She had a degree she hadn't used in 6 years, a pickup truck with 214,000 miles on it, 63 acres of farmland in Clover Ridge Valley, and $211,000 in debt that the bank was done being patient about. She unfolded the letter again, even though she'd already read it enough times to recite it from memory. Pursuant to the terms of the loan agreement dated October 14th, failure to remit, legal proceedings may commence. She folded it back up, tucked it under the sugar bowl where she wouldn't have to look at it. Outside, one of the goats was making noise, probably the fence again. The east fence had been slowly losing the battle against gravity and rust for the better part of a year, and Ava had been patching it with whatever she could find: wire, zip ties, a piece of pipe she'd salvaged from the old barn. She picked up her coffee, pushed through the screen door, and walked out into the pale morning. The valley was beautiful in the early light. She'd give it that. The hills rolled out soft and green to the east, the morning mist still sitting low in the hollows, the sky going pink and gold above the tree line. Her father had loved this time of day. He used to say the valley looked like it was being born again every morning. Ava looked at the fence. The goat, a mean, opinionated animal named Biscuit, had her head stuck through a gap in the wire and was systematically stripping leaves off the volunteer elderberry bush that had grown up alongside the fence post. Ava set her coffee on the nearest fence rail, grabbed the goat by the collar, and wrestled her back to the right side of the fence. "You do this every single day," Ava told her. Biscuit stared at her with those strange rectangular goat pupils and showed absolutely no remorse. Ava picked up her coffee, looked at the fence, looked at the elderberry bush, which was now significantly shorter on one side. She went to get the wire cutters. She was out on Route 9 by 8:30, driving into Mill Haven to pick up fence wire and a replacement pump gasket she'd been putting off buying for 3 weeks. Route 9 was the old state road, 2 lanes, cracked asphalt, no shoulder worth mentioning, running through the low country between the valley and town. Almost nobody used it since they'd finished the bypass 5 years ago. Ava used it because it saved her 4 miles each way, and 4 miles mattered when you were watching the gas gauge. She had the windows down. The radio was doing that thing it did in summer where it picked up a country station from somewhere 3 states over and played it clear as a bell for exactly 12 minutes before dissolving into static. She sang along with the parts she knew and hummed the parts she didn't. She almost missed him. The car was pulled onto what passed for a shoulder, a narrow strip of weedy gravel between the road's edge and a shallow ditch, with its hazard lights on. A black Mercedes. Brand new, from the look of it, or close to it. One of the big ones. Out here on Route 9, that car looked like a spaceship that had made an emergency landing on the wrong planet. Ava's first instinct was to keep driving. She had things to do. She had a list. She had a life that didn't leave room for unscheduled stops. Her second instinct, the one she'd grown up with, the one her father had installed in her the same way he'd installed everything else, through patient example and zero tolerance for looking the other way. That instinct told her to pull over. She pulled over. She sat in the truck for a second, looking at the Mercedes in her rearview mirror. Nobody had gotten out. The hazards were still blinking. She grabbed her baseball cap off the passenger seat, put it on, and got out. The heat hit her like a wall. By 8:30 in mid-July, Clover Ridge Valley was already operating at a temperature that made you question your life choices. Ava's boots crunched on the gravel as she walked back toward the car. The driver's window was down. She could see a hand gripping the top of the door frame. A man's hand, strong-looking, tanned. She stopped a few feet back because you learned caution on empty roads. "Hey," she called out. "You need help?" The door opened. The man who got out was not what she expected, though she would have been hard-pressed to say what she had expected. He was tall, taller than she'd estimated from his hand, with dark hair that was slightly too long to be intentional, like he just kept meaning to get it cut and hadn't gotten around to it. He was wearing dress pants and a white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and he looked spectacularly out of place on Route 9 in the same way his car did, like something had gone wrong in his navigation and he'd ended up somewhere the algorithm hadn't accounted for. He was also, she noticed, sweating through that white shirt in a way that suggested he'd been standing in the heat for a while before she stopped. "Flat tire," he said. He had a careful voice, measured, like a man used to choosing his words. "I've been trying to reach roadside assistance for 40 minutes. My phone has no signal out here." "Yeah," Ava said. "There's no signal between the Hendersons' driveway and the county road. About an 8-mile gap. You in the middle of it." He looked at her. She wasn't sure what he was expecting either. "Do you—" he started. "I've got a jack," she said, "and I know how to use it. Pop your trunk." His name, she did not ask. She got the jack from her truck, assessed the situation, rear passenger tire, clean puncture, looked like a nail, and got to work. He offered to help twice. The first time she handed him the hubcap. The second time she asked him to hold the flashlight even though it was broad daylight, because it gave him something to do and people standing around watching made her uncomfortable. "You do this often?" he asked. "Change tires? Enough." She loosened the first lug nut. The torque was off. They'd been over-tightened, probably at the dealership. She leaned into it. "You shouldn't have your tires torqued this tight. Does your dealership use a torque wrench, or do they just use the air gun and let it rip?" A pause. "I have no idea." "That's the problem." She got the nut loose, moved to the next one. "Tell them to use a torque wrench. These things can warp the rotor if they're too tight." "I'll do that." She glanced up at him. He was watching her work with an expression she couldn't quite name. Not condescending, not the look she sometimes got from men who were surprised that a woman knew which end of a wrench to hold. It was something closer to genuine attention, like he was actually paying attention to what she was saying. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "Business." He paused. "Outside of Millhaven." "Long way to come for business." "It is." She lifted the flat off, set it aside, rolled the spare into position. The spare was a full size. Good. She'd half expected a donut on a car like this. "You didn't have to stop," he said after a while. "I know." "Most people wouldn't have." She shrugged, seating the spare on the hub. "My dad raised me to stop." She said it simply, the way you say things that are so deeply true they don't need decoration. She didn't say he was gone. She didn't need to. She got the spare mounted, tightened the lug nuts in the proper star pattern, none of this going around the circle like an amateur, and lowered the jack. She stood up, dusted her hands on her jeans, and started loading her equipment back into the truck. "What do I owe you?" the man asked. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Nothing." "I'd like to, Nothing," she said again, but without heat. It wasn't the kind of nothing that meant I'm being polite. It was the kind that meant I mean it and we're done discussing it. She could see him working through this. Men like him, and she knew the type, even if she couldn't have put a name to it, men who solved every problem with money because that was the only tool they'd ever needed. Men like him had trouble with the word nothing. "At least let me—" "Mister," she said, and she got in the truck. "Take your car to a dealership and get them to check the spare. It's probably been in there since the car was manufactured and the tire pressure could be off." She started the engine. "Have a good day?" She pulled out onto Route 9 and didn't look in the rearview mirror. His name was Mason Sterling. She didn't know that. She wouldn't know it for another 9 days. Mason stood on the shoulder of Route 9 and watched the pickup truck until it disappeared around the curve. The hazard lights on his Mercedes were still blinking. He reached in through the open window and turned them off. Then he just stood there for a moment in the heat. He was 32 years old. He had a net worth that he sometimes forgot the exact number of because his financial team updated it quarterly, and he didn't always read the full report. He had a daughter, Sophie, 6 years old, currently with her grandmother in the city because her school was on summer break and Mason had a trip to make. He had a penthouse apartment, 4 cars, and a company called Sterling Logistics that his father had started, and he had turned into something large enough that the Wall Street Journal had run a profile on him last spring. He had a great many things. He stood on the crumbling shoulder of a road nobody used anymore, and thought about a woman in a baseball cap who had changed his tire without asking his name, told him to fix his lug nut torque, and refused his money with the calm certainty of someone who had thought about this a long time ago and already decided. He got in the car. He sat there for a moment before turning the key. He had not felt that off balance in years. Millhaven was the kind of small town that looked almost prosperous from the highway. A church steeple, a water tower, a grain elevator that still functioned, but showed its actual condition once you got inside it. 3 of the storefronts on Main Street were empty. The diner had a sign in the window advertising a lunch special that hadn't been updated since the previous November. The barbershop was open and the farm supply store and a bail bonds office that seemed to be doing fine. Mason parked in front of the Millhaven County building and met his site director, Carl Reeves, on the steps. Carl was 48, practical, had been with Sterling Logistics for 11 years and had been coordinating the Clover Ridge Valley project for the last 14 months. He had a rolled-up set of site maps under his arm and the look of a man who was about to say something complicated. "The Harper property," he said, without preamble. "Tell me." "Still unresolved." Carl spread the maps on the hood of Mason's car, smoothing them flat. The Clover Ridge Valley development was drawn out in precise lines. The proposed distribution hub, the access roads, the rail spur connection, the staging areas. In the middle of it, slightly to the east, was a parcel outlined in red. 63 acres. The Harper Farm. Every other landowner in the valley has signed. We've got the Kowalski place, the Hendersons, both pieces of the old Drummond property. But this one, Carl tapped the red outline. The bank has a foreclosure proceeding going, but it's stalled in county court. Our attorneys say we can't move forward until it resolves or until we get a voluntary sale. What do we know about the owner? Ava Harper, 30 years old, took over the property after her father died about 18 months ago. She's carrying substantial debt, operating loans, some estate taxes, a repair loan she took out last fall. Bank's been patient, but they're done. Carl paused. She's not selling, though. We've sent 2 letters, standard acquisition offer, fair market plus 15%. No response to either one. Mason looked at the red outline on the map. She grew up on that land? All her life. Father's family before her. 3 generations on the same property. Mason was quiet for a moment. He thought about a woman changing a tire on Route 9 with the competence of someone who had been solving her own problems her entire life. He thought about the way she'd said, "My dad raised me to stop." Simple. No sentiment attached to the surface of it. All the sentiment underneath. "Set up a meeting," he said. Carl looked uncertain. "Typically at this stage we send legal—" "Set up a meeting," Mason said again. "With me. The Harper farm was not what Mason expected, which meant he had walked in with the wrong expectations. He drove out 4 days later, after Carl had made the calls and Ava Harper had, with obvious reluctance, agreed to a 30-minute meeting. Mason drove himself in a different car, one of his older ones, a 6-year-old Land Cruiser that he kept for road trips, less conspicuous than the Mercedes. He didn't think much about why he made that choice. He just made it. The farm was down a gravel road off Route 9, past a rusting mailbox with the numbers barely legible. The lane ran between 2 lines of old trees, oaks mostly, big ones that had been there longer than any building on the property, and opened up into a yard with a farmhouse on the left, a barn on the right, and a collection of smaller outbuildings scattered between. The house had been white once. Now it was the color of things that had been painted and repainted again over many decades, settling into something between cream and gray. The porch sagged slightly on the left end. There were flowers in window boxes that looked like they were being watered despite everything else going on, and Mason noticed that because it struck him. The deliberate act of planting flowers when you were drowning in debt. Ava was in the barn. He found her because he followed the sound of something metallic being dealt with aggressively. She was crouched behind a machine he eventually identified as a hay baler, and she had a wrench in her hand, and she was saying things under her breath that he thought it was probably better he couldn't fully make out. "Miss Harper." She looked up. The recognition was immediate. He could see it move across her face in the way that real surprise does. Not the polished kind, but the kind that catches you before you can decide what to do with it. "You," she said. "Me," he said. She stood up slowly. She had grease on her forearm, and she was wearing the same boots she'd been wearing on Route 9, or ones just like them. She looked at him with an expression that was doing a lot of things at once: recognition, wariness, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "You're from the company," she said. It wasn't a question. "Sterling Logistics, yes, I'm Mason Sterling." Something moved through her expression. Not quite anger, not yet. Something more like the specific feeling of having the shape of a thing you'd been dreading confirmed. "I changed your tire," she said. "You did. And you drove out here to—" She stopped. Set the wrench down on top of the baler with a clank. "What exactly are you here for, Mr. Sterling?" "To talk," he said. "Not to make an offer. Not yet. To talk." She looked at him for a long moment. The barn smelled like hay and machine oil and old wood, and somewhere outside one of the goats was making its feelings known about something. 30 minutes, she said. "I've got work to do." They sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table Ava had been sitting at 5:47 in the morning 4 days ago, except now she'd moved the letter from under the sugar bowl and put it somewhere else entirely. Mason noticed the effort that had gone into making the kitchen look like everything was fine. The dishes were done. The floor was swept. There was a jar of the volunteer elderberry on the windowsill, just the branches with the small flowers stuck in a mason jar of water. Someone who paid attention to small things would notice that it was the effort of a proud person who was tired. Mason paid attention to small things. She put coffee in front of him without asking. He drank it without complaining that it was strong enough to strip paint. He thought, privately, that it was the best coffee he'd had in months. The kind of coffee you only get when someone makes it with a calibrated disregard for moderation. "You know why your company wants this land," she said. It wasn't a question either. "The development project needs this parcel to complete the access corridor," he said. "Without it, we can't connect the rail spur to the main hub site. The entire project geometry depends on it. So I'm the last piece." "You're the last piece." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "And if I don't sell?" He was quiet for a moment. He could have said the bank will foreclose and we'll negotiate with them. He could have said our lawyers will find a way. He could have said any number of things that were technically true and would have sounded like threats without technically being threats. "I don't know," he said instead. She looked at him. "That's not a line," he said. "I genuinely don't know what happens if you don't sell. We'd have to redesign the project. We might not be able to." "Would you redesign it?" Another pause. He was not a man accustomed to honest pauses. He was accustomed to having answers ready. "I don't know that either," he said. The kitchen was very quiet except for the ceiling fan and whatever that goat was upset about outside. "My great-grandfather broke this land," Ava said. "Cleared the trees on the South 40 himself. My grandfather added the irrigation system, dug most of the trenches by hand over 2 summers. My father put in the barn you came through with 3 other men and no contractor. Every generation of my family has put something into this place." She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the mason jar of elderberry branches on the windowsill. "I know what the debt looks like. I know what the bank wants to do. I'm not stupid about the situation I'm in." She looked back at him. But this land is not a piece of a corridor. It's not a parcel. It's all of them. Mason set his coffee down. I know, he said. It was the wrong answer, or maybe the only honest one. But he came back. That was the thing nobody expected. Not Carl, not his executive team, when he gave them vague answers about the timeline, and certainly not Ava, who had told him 30 minutes and meant it, and had stood up exactly when the time was up, and shown him the door with the absolute minimum of ceremony. He came back 6 days later. He told himself it was due diligence. He told himself he needed to understand the property better, the land values, the agricultural use, the implications of the acquisition. He had a long list of professional justifications that he was fairly confident he didn't entirely believe. He pulled down the gravel lane in the Land Cruiser on a Tuesday morning and found Ava trying to move a section of the east fence by herself. The section that had been losing to gravity, as it turned out, had now lost entirely and come down, and she was attempting to drag it upright while simultaneously trying to keep Biscuit the goat from making a break for the open field. It was not going well. "Hold on," Mason said, and grabbed the fence post before he'd thought about whether grabbing the fence post was a good idea. It wasn't, entirely. The wire was sharp in places and caught his palm through his light jacket, and he said something he probably shouldn't have said out loud. And Ava looked at him with an expression caught exactly halfway between gratitude and amusement. "You're going to want gloves," she said. "I don't have any. I'll get you some." She went to the barn and came back with a pair of heavy leather work gloves that were too big for his hands but functional. Together, they got the fence section upright, braced the post with a piece of scrap lumber, and spent the next hour walking the rest of the east line looking for additional failures. There were 6 more spots that needed attention. "This is a lot of fence," Mason said. 63 acres is a lot of fence," Ava said, "and my father maintained it himself for 30 years, but the last 2 winters were bad and I haven't had time to do the whole line." She paused. "I will." "I didn't say you wouldn't." She glanced at him sideways. He helped with the fence. He wasn't good at it initially. He'd had no experience with agricultural fencing, and there was a learning curve that involved several wrong approaches and at least one incident with the wire stretcher that he'd rather not think about, but he was willing to do the thing badly while he got better at it, which Ava noticed. Most people, when they couldn't do something well immediately, stopped doing it. Mason Sterling kept going. "You're not what I thought you'd be," she said, around noon, sitting on the tailgate of her truck eating sandwiches she'd made. He hadn't brought lunch, hadn't thought of it, and she'd made enough for 2 without commenting on it. "What did you think I'd be?" "Someone who sent a lawyer," she said. "Someone who made a phone call and never came in person. Someone who thought buying things was the same as understanding them." "I used to be that person." "What changed?" He was quiet for a moment. "My daughter," he said. "She asks questions I don't have good answers to, about what I do, about what matters, about—" He stopped. "She's 6. 6-year-olds have no patience for complicated answers. They want simple ones. And simple answers to her questions kept coming back wrong." Ava looked at him. "What's her name?" "Sophie." "How long has it been just you 2? He didn't flinch at the directness of it. He'd learned that Ava Harper asked what she wanted to know and didn't dress it up. 4 years. Sophie was 2. Her mother, it was an aneurysm. Nothing. There was no warning. Nothing to be done." Ava was quiet. She handed him the other half of her sandwich. "I'm sorry," she said. Just that. Not the extended version, not the performance of condolence. Just the 2 words, meaning exactly what they said. "Thank you," he said, meaning it. Dad. He brought Sophie the second time. He hadn't planned to. He'd planned to come alone on a Thursday, help Ava with the irrigation issue she'd mentioned. One of the secondary lines had a pressure problem, and be gone by the afternoon. But Sophie's grandmother had a dental appointment that couldn't be moved, and Mason's regular childcare option was unavailable, and Sophie had been in the office with him all morning, getting increasingly bored and communicating this through a series of sighs of escalating drama. He could have found another solution. He made a lot of decisions in a day. Finding alternative childcare for 4 hours was not a complicated problem. But Sophie had heard him mention the farm. He'd said something vague about going to help with a fence months ago, when she'd asked where he was going, and she'd remembered it with the utter reliability of 6-year-olds remembering exactly the things you'd rather they didn't. "Are we going to the farm?" she asked, looking up from her coloring. "I'm going to the farm." "Am I going with you?" Mason looked at his daughter. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, very direct, and her mother's habit of asking questions that were technically yes or no but weren't really. "Do you want to go to the farm?" She put down her crayon. "Yes." "What?" He called Ava from the road. "I'm bringing my daughter," he said. "I should have asked." It's fine," Ava said. "She might be in the way." "Children are always in the way," Ava said. "That's kind of what they do." "It's fine, Mason." It was the first time she'd used his first name. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed it. Buck. Sophie met Biscuit the goat, and this was, as events went, significant. Biscuit was not generally what anyone would describe as a warm and welcoming animal. She had opinions about everything and no particular interest in moderating them for the comfort of others. She had once chased Carl Reeves 12 feet across the yard when he'd made the mistake of walking too close to her feed area, which was technically a highlight of Mason's summer. Sophie walked right up to Biscuit. "Hi," she said. Biscuit looked at her with those rectangular pupils. Sophie looked back. Some kind of negotiation happened, invisible to the adults watching from the porch, and then Biscuit dropped her head and allowed Sophie to scratch behind her ears. "Oh," Ava said. "She doesn't do that," Mason said. "She really doesn't do that," Ava said. Sophie turned around, beaming. "She's so soft," she announced. "She is not soft," Ava said. "She's prickly and rude." Sophie looked at Biscuit. Biscuit was leaning into the ear scratch in a way that was embarrassingly obvious. "She seems nice to me," Sophie said. Ava looked at Mason. Mason looked at his daughter. "She's always been like this," he said. "Animals just—" He gestured vaguely. "I see that," Ava said. Sophie spent the next 3 hours following Ava around the farm with the focused devotion of a small, earnest scientist. She asked questions, an enormous number of questions. What did the chickens eat? Why did the goat have weird eyes? What was that machine for? Why did the hay smell like that? Could she hold the chicken? Why did that chicken seem angry? Was the barn safe? How old were the trees? Why was the fence wire so scratchy? Who decided to put the farm here? Did Ava live here all by herself? "I do," Ava said. Sophie considered this. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Ava was quiet for a moment. They were standing in the middle of the hayfield, the part that was still producing, and the afternoon light was coming down golden and heavy, and somewhere up the hill the old oaks were moving in a slight breeze that hadn't reached them yet. "Sometimes," Ava said. "But it's mine, so it feels different than just being alone." Sophie thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. Like how my room feels different when I'm by myself in it than when I'm by myself somewhere else? Ava looked at her. "Exactly like that." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "That makes sense." And Mason was replacing a section of fence board on the south side of the barn when he heard Sophie laugh, really laugh, the big unguarded kind, and looked up to see Ava teaching her how to scatter chicken feed. Ava was showing her the wrist motion, the wide arc, making it a little theatrical, and Sophie was attempting it with the feed bucket, and the chickens were going absolutely berserk trying to get to the scattered grain, and Sophie found this hilarious, and Ava was laughing too, and Mason stood with the hammer in his hand for a moment longer than he needed to. He'd seen Sophie laugh plenty of times. She was a happy child, mostly. She'd had enough love and stability around her that the loss of her mother had shaped her without breaking her. But there was something in that laugh, something in the specific quality of it on that particular afternoon that made Mason's chest do something complicated. She looked like she belonged here, not on this farm specifically, but in this kind of afternoon, this kind of light, this kind of uncomplicated happiness. He went back to the fence board. He hit the nail slightly crooked and had to pull it and start over. They left when the sun was starting to get low. Sophie fell asleep in the back seat before they'd reached Route 9, her head tipped sideways against the window, still in her barn boots. Mason drove in the quiet for a while. He had a call with his executive team at 9 the next morning. There was a board presentation the following week. The Clover Ridge Valley project scheduled as the second agenda item, with a project timeline that assumed resolution of the Harper property within 60 days. Carl had emailed him a revised acquisition offer, 15% above the original, drafted by legal and ready to send. He had not looked at the email since it came in. He didn't look at it now. He drove through the darkening valley, past the old oaks, out to the highway, with his daughter sleeping in the back, and the farm getting smaller in the mirror. He thought about what Sophie had said. That makes sense. He thought about Ava's face when she said sometimes. He thought about a woman who planted flowers in window boxes when she was drowning because the debt was the debt, but the flowers were hers, and those were two separate things. He drove. Ava stood on the porch after the taillights of the Land Cruiser disappeared down the lane, and she stood there for a while in the blue evening while the chickens settled and Biscuit made one final remark to no one in particular, and the first stars appeared over the eastern ridge. She was in trouble. She was already in the financial kind, which she'd known about for months. But this was a different kind, and it was creeping in quieter, and that made it more dangerous in a different way. She was starting to like him, not the company, not what he represented, not the plan to put a logistics hub in the middle of the valley where 3 generations of families had grown food and raised animals. That she did not like at all, and she had no intention of forgetting it. But him. Mason Sterling, who had shown up in dress pants to help with a fence and done a bad job and kept doing it until he got better. Mason Sterling, who had brought his daughter to a farm and then stood quietly at a distance so Sophie could have her own experience of it without being managed. Mason Sterling, who hadn't lied to her at the kitchen table when she'd asked hard questions. I don't know that either. She didn't know what to do with that honesty. She went inside. She looked at the sugar bowl. She didn't look under it. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The goat got out 3 more times that week. The east fence was the problem. It was always the east fence, and Ava had patched it with everything she had. But the real fix required new posts and new wire and time she didn't have and money she didn't have, and she was tired of it. In the way you get tired of a problem that just keeps being the same problem, no matter how many times you address it. She was out there on a Saturday morning in the heat, wrestling with the wire, when she heard a truck pull into the yard. Not Mason's Land Cruiser. A different truck. Older. White, with Millhaven Hardware stenciled on the door. It backed up near the fence line, and the driver got out and started unloading fencing materials from the bed. New posts, new wire rolls, post driver. What's this? Ava said. The driver, she recognized him as one of the Kowalski nephews who worked at the hardware store, shrugged. Already paid for. Guy called in the order 2 days ago, said to bring it out today. What guy? The Kowalski nephew looked at the delivery order. Sterling? Mason Sterling? Ava stared at the fence posts. She thought about calling him and telling him to come take his fence posts back. She rehearsed the conversation. She was good at that conversation. She'd had versions of it her whole life, the one where she established that she didn't need someone else's help, that she was handling things, that she didn't want anyone's charity. She looked at the east fence. She looked at Biscuit, who was watching from a suspicious distance. She thought about her father, who had taught her to stop for stranded drivers on empty roads, and what he would say about the gap between pride and stubbornness. She looked at the delivery again. Okay, she said to the Kowalski nephew. Leave it over by the gate. She texted Mason that evening. The fence posts arrived. A pause. Thank you. He texted back. I figured the east line needed real posts, not patches. She looked at her phone for a long moment. Then she typed, How did you know it was the east line? A longer pause. Then, because that's the one you were always looking at. She put the phone down. She had absolutely no idea what to do with any of this. The farm was still in debt. The company still had plans for this valley. The bank was still counting down. None of that had changed. But something was different in the house that night. She couldn't put her finger on what. It was something in the quality of the air, maybe, or the way the ceiling fans sounded, or just the fact that somewhere in Millhaven there were fence posts with her name on them, paid for by a billionaire who noticed which fence she kept looking at. She went to sleep before 9. She slept better than she had in weeks. The fence posts went in on a Monday. Mason showed up to help, which Ava hadn't asked for and had half expected anyway. He arrived at 7 in the morning with coffee. 2 cups, in a carrier from a place in Millhaven that she hadn't known made decent coffee, and work gloves that actually fit his hands this time. She noticed the gloves. He'd bought them specifically. She didn't say anything about that. They worked the east line from the gate post northward, pulling the old rotted posts, tamping in the new ones with the driver, stretching the wire tight, and clean the way her father had taught her to do it. Not so tight it would snap in a frost, not so loose it would belly out in summer. Mason learned fast. She'd give him that. He made mistakes the first hour and fewer the second, and by the time they'd reached the corner post, he was doing the stapling on his own without her checking his work. It was a hot morning. By 9 o'clock, the kind of hot that sits on you, and by 10, it was the kind that makes you question everything. They stopped for water under the big oak at the corner of the property line, and Mason sat on the ground with his back against the tree trunk in a way that no one who'd grown up with money usually sat. Just dropped down without thinking about it, because he was tired and the ground was there. "Tell me about your father," he said. Ava poured water over the back of her neck. "Why?" "Because you mention him the way people mention someone they're still figuring out how to carry." She looked at him. That was a more precise thing to say than she'd expected. "He was stubborn," she said finally. "Worked too hard. Didn't talk about money because talking about it made it more real. Kept this place going on willpower for about a decade after willpower stopped being enough." She paused. "He was the best man I've ever known, and he left me a mess. Those two things aren't contradictory." "No," she said. "They're not." A woodpecker was working somewhere in the tree above them. The sound of it carried far in the still hot air. "My father left me a company," Mason said, "which sounds better than a farm in debt, on paper. But Sterling Logistics was a mid-size regional carrier when he died, and he'd run it on relationships and handshakes and a way of doing business that doesn't really exist anymore. I spent the first 2 years just modernizing the infrastructure, losing half his old clients in the process because they liked the handshake version and didn't want the corporate version." He turned the water bottle in his hands. "He would have hated what I turned it into. He would have been proud of what it became. I've never figured out how to hold both of those things at once." Ava was quiet for a moment. "You just hold them," she said. "You don't figure it out. You just hold them at the same time, and eventually it stops being so heavy." He looked at her. "Has it stopped being heavy?" he asked. "Not yet," she said honestly. "But it's different heavy than it was. Like it's shifting from the front of you to the back. You stop bracing against it and start just carrying it." He nodded slowly. They went back to the fence. By noon, the east line was done. Genuinely done. Not patch done. Not we'll fix it properly later done. But solid new posts and tight clean wire for the whole length of it. Ava walked it from end to end, testing each post with her hand, checking the wire tension. It was good work. She didn't say so out loud, but she didn't have to. Mason could tell by the fact that she stopped testing things and started putting tools away, which was the practical equivalent of approval. Biscuit immediately went to investigate the new fence. She pushed against it in 3 different places, found no weakness, and walked away with the specific dignity of an animal who has lost a round but has not conceded the war. "She's going to find a way through it," Mason said. "She always does," Ava said, "but it'll take her a while." They ate lunch on the tailgate again. She'd made sandwiches again without commenting on it. Ham and cheese, same as before. He'd noticed she made the same things repeatedly. Not because she lacked imagination, but because she bought in quantities and used everything up before buying more. It was a kind of cooking that came from paying attention to what you had. He was learning to read the farm through what he saw her do. The way she moved through it, what she checked first in the mornings, where she lingered. The irrigation line she'd mentioned, the one with the pressure problem. He could see her detour past it every time she crossed the south field. Just a glance. The habit of watching something you're worried about. The roof of the smaller outbuilding, where a section of metal sheeting had lifted slightly at one corner, and she'd weighted it with 2 cinder blocks as a temporary fix. The gate to the upper pasture that didn't latch properly, so she always used the rope loop instead, and had looped the rope so many times the motion was automatic. He was cataloging things. He told himself this was professional, understanding the property. But that explanation had started to feel thin. "What's in the upper pasture?" he asked. "Right now, nothing. I had a small beef operation going, 4 head, but I sold them off last fall when the hay prices went up and I couldn't float the feed costs. She paused. That was the thing that made me realize how bad the numbers actually were. When I looked at what I'd have to sell to stay current, and it was the cattle. My dad ran beef on that upper pasture for 25 years. You'll put them back, he said. She looked at him. Not angry, something more complicated than angry. Don't do that. Do what? Say things like that, easy reassurances. You'll put them back. You don't know that. He was quiet. She was right. I'm sorry, he said. She ate her sandwich. I know you mean well, she said after a moment. That's not the problem. The problem is that meaning well doesn't change what the numbers say. She looked out at the upper pasture, the empty green of it in the afternoon heat. I'm not giving up on this place. I want to be clear about that. But I'm also not going to pretend the situation is something it isn't, because that's how my dad ended up where he ended up. He was an optimist about the numbers right up until he couldn't be anymore. Mason set down his sandwich. How much time do you have? With the bank? My attorney thinks we can push the foreclosure proceeding another 90 days, maybe 110 if the county court keeps moving slowly. After that, she shrugged. After that, it depends on whether I can come up with something they'll accept. How much? She told him. He didn't flinch, which she noticed. He didn't do the thing people did when you told them a number like that, the slight recession, the recalibration of the situation. He just absorbed it and kept looking at her. That's manageable, he said. Not for me, it isn't. I know, he said. I'm not saying it like it's your problem to solve alone. I'm saying, he stopped, seemed to be deciding something. I'm saying there are options that haven't been fully explored. If the next thing you say has anything to do with your company's acquisition offer. It doesn't. He picked his sandwich back up. Not right now. That's not what I'm talking about. She studied him for a long moment. The wariness was there. It was always going to be there. It would be foolish for it not to be. But she was getting better at reading him, the same way he was getting better at reading the farm. He was a man who thought before he spoke and said less than he knew, and occasionally said exactly the right thing without seeming to try. That was a specific type of person, and it was not the type she'd expected to find in the CEO of Sterling Logistics. What are you talking about then? She asked. I don't know yet, he said. I'm still working it out. She looked at him for another moment, then looked away. Okay, she said. It was not agreement. It was the specific word that meant, I've noted what you said and I'm watching to see what you do with it. Mason understood the difference. He finished his sandwich. They went back to work. The afternoon passed the way good working afternoons do. Not quickly, exactly, but without the weight of time. Mason helped her repair the latch on the upper pasture gate properly, not with a rope loop, but with an actual hardware fix using parts she'd had in the workshop and hadn't gotten to. He was better with tools than she'd given him credit for initially, not skilled the way someone trained for it was skilled, but competent in the way that people who grew up solving their own problems were competent. He'd mentioned his father's company as something he'd stepped into young. She suspected there had been a period where he'd had to figure a lot of things out on his own. When the shadows had gotten long and the heat had finally, grudgingly begun to ease, Mason cleaned up the tools without being asked and stacked them in the workshop the way she kept them. She'd only had to show him once where things went. He came out and found her sitting on the porch steps with her boots off, which was the first time she'd let herself be that unoffensive in his presence. Same time next week? He said. She looked up. You have a company to run. I also have a farm that needs work, he said. Apparently. She narrowed her eyes. It's not your farm. No, he said. It's yours. I'm just... He searched for the right word. Helping. She held his look for a beat. The south field has a drainage problem, she said finally. Low spot near the tree line catches water and doesn't clear for days after rain. Been meaning to fix the grade there for 2 years. I'll look at it. You'll need to rent equipment. I'll rent equipment. She looked at him for one more moment, this billionaire standing in her yard with grease on his forearms and a fence-line blister she could see forming on his right palm even from here, looking at her with an expression that was just steady. That was the word for it. Not eager, not calculating, not performing. Just steady. Okay, she said again. Same word, different weight. This time it meant something a degree closer to yes. He left. She sat on the porch until the light went, and the valley filled up with the particular blue quiet of summer evenings, the kind that had always made her feel simultaneously at peace and restless, like something was coming she couldn't name yet. She thought about what he'd said. There are options that haven't been fully explored. She thought about the way he'd said it, not like a promise, not like a man who was going to ride in and fix things, but like someone who was genuinely turning a problem over, looking at it from the edges. She didn't know what to do with that either, but she kept thinking about it. That was the thing. She kept thinking about it long after she should have been asleep, lying in the upstairs room with the window open and the valley sounds coming in. And for the first time in a long time, the thinking wasn't about the debt or the fence or the water pump. It was about a person, a specific, complicated, not easily categorized person. She hadn't done that kind of thinking in a long time. It worried her, a little. She fell asleep anyway. The next 9 days moved in a way that felt strange to Mason in retrospect, like the rhythm of his weeks had shifted without his authorizing it. He had his regular obligations, the executive calls, the board prep, the quarterly review that Carl kept rescheduling because the Clover Ridge project timeline kept being listed as pending resolution with no further detail. Mason's assistant had started leaving longer gaps in his schedule on Tuesdays and Fridays without being asked, which meant she'd noticed something he hadn't explicitly said and was accommodating it, which was both efficient and slightly unnerving. He drove out on Thursday, not Tuesday, because Ava had texted him that the water pump had finally given out and she needed another set of hands to get the replacement in. The pump was in the lower field, at the irrigation head, accessible via a narrow access path that her truck could barely fit down. Mason brought the equipment rental, a small backhoe he'd arranged through a place in Mill Haven, driven out by a rental tech who looked at the terrain, pronounced it workable, and left. He had not driven a backhoe before. This turned out to be relevant. "You've used one of these?" Ava asked, looking at the machine. "I watched 3 YouTube videos," Mason said. She stared at him. "They were very detailed videos," he said. "Mason?" "I learn fast." She pressed her lips together in a way that was fighting something. He thought it might be a laugh. "Get in," she said finally. "I'll talk you through it. And if you tear up the irrigation pipe I just paid $300 for, I'm taking it out of your car." "That's fair?" He did tear up a small section of the irrigation pipe, just one section. It was repairable, and he repaired it while Ava held the flashlight, actual darkness this time, not broad daylight. And she only made 2 comments about the YouTube videos. The pump was in by 8 o'clock in the evening. It ran. The pressure gauge came up and held where it should, and Ava stood there in the dark with the flashlight pointed at the gauge and watched the needle settle. And the relief on her face was so unguarded, so purely physical, that Mason looked away because it felt like something private. "That's been wrong for a month," she said. "I know. I kept telling myself I'd get to it. You had other things to get to." She looked at him. In the beam of the flashlight, holding the pump cover, with dirt on her face and her hair coming out of its braid, she looked exactly like what she was. A person who had been holding too many things for too long and had just put one of them down. "Thank you," she said. Directly. No qualifications. "You're welcome, Swissam," he said. "The same way." They stood there for a second in the dark, with the pump running clean and the valley insects making their noise around them, and then she turned the flashlight off and they walked back to the farm. Sophie came back the following Tuesday. This time it wasn't a scheduling problem. Mason brought her deliberately, and Ava knew it, and neither of them said anything about the deliberateness. Sophie arrived with a backpack containing a library book about goats, a drawing she had made of Biscuit that was impressionistic in approach but specific in certain key details, the rectangular pupils, the general air of judgment, and an opinion about where goat grazing areas should be placed relative to fence lines that she had apparently developed through research. "She'll want to get through any fence," Sophie explained to Ava, showing the book open to a diagram of goat behavior. "It's because they're curious. They're not doing it to be bad." "I know," Ava said. "I've had Biscuit for 4 years. Sophie considered this. "Did you know that when she was born?" "Not exactly. You learned it from her. I did. Sophie nodded, satisfied by the symmetry of this. She closed the book. I brought my drawing, she said, and produced it from the backpack. Ava took the drawing carefully, the way you take things from children when you understand the weight they've been given. She looked at it for a real moment, not a polite one. You got her eyes exactly right, she said. Sophie beamed. Can I put it somewhere? They put it on the refrigerator, between a phone number for the vet and a reminder about the County Water Authority meeting. Sophie stood back and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully made their mark on a place. Mason watched this from the doorway between the kitchen and the hall. He was holding 2 mugs of coffee. He'd learned where the mugs were, learned how Ava made her coffee, had started making it himself when he arrived first, and he watched his daughter stand in front of the refrigerator in a farmhouse kitchen in Clover Ridge Valley, looking like she'd been there 100 times. Something hurt in his chest. Not a bad hurt. The kind that happens when something you'd stopped letting yourself want gets close enough to almost touch. He brought the coffee over. Outside, over the following weeks, the farm's condition shifted in increments that were subtle to anyone who wasn't watching closely, and obvious to anyone who was. The Southfield drainage improved after Mason spent 2 days with rented equipment regrading the low spot. It wasn't perfect. It would need another pass in fall, but it was no longer holding water 4 days after a rain. The smaller outbuilding got its lifted metal sheeting properly secured rather than cinder block weighted. The workshop, which had been a careful disaster of imperfect organization, got sorted into something functional after Mason spent one long Saturday afternoon moving things while Ava supervised and told him where each item actually lived, because she had a system that didn't look like a system, but was. You have opinions about the workshop organization, she observed. I have opinions about everything, he said, moving a bin of fasteners to the shelf she'd indicated. I keep most of them to myself. That is not my experience. With other things, he clarified, not the workshop. She handed him a coil of wire to hang on the hook by the door. What else do you have opinions about? Your irrigation setup, your hay storage, the fact that the tractor hasn't been serviced in... He looked at the maintenance log she kept tacked to the wall. 22 months. I know when the tractor was last serviced. I know you know. I'm just noting that I noticed. Is noticing the same as having an opinion? In my experience, yes. She looked at him with an expression that was doing multiple things. Exasperation was in there. So was something warmer, and she was pretty clearly trying to manage the balance of those 2 things. You can take it to the service place in Mill Haven if you want to, she said, and then added quickly, that is not me asking you to. I know. I'm just saying if you were going to have an opinion about the tractor, I'll make an appointment. I didn't ask. Ava, she stopped. Let me, he said. Simple. Not let me help because that carried the weight of charity, which she'd made clear she had issues with. Just let me. Like it was something he needed as much as she needed to allow it. She looked at him for a beat. Fine, she said, but you're driving it there yourself. I'm not hauling it. He drove the tractor to Millhaven the following Wednesday. It took 40 minutes each way on the county road because tractors don't move fast, and a teenager in a pickup truck passed him doing about twice the speed limit and honked in what Mason chose to interpret as solidarity. The service took 2 days and cost less than he'd expected, and when he drove it back, the engine ran smoother than it had in probably 2 years, and Ava ran it across the north field the afternoon it came back, and then turned it off and sat on it for a moment with her hands on the wheel in a way that was private enough that Mason went to check the water pump rather than watch. Carl called him on a Wednesday afternoon when Mason was helping Ava repair a section of roof on the smaller outbuilding. Mason was standing on a ladder with a sheet of metal roofing and a drill, which was not the ideal position to take a phone call, but Carl's calls had a particular rhythm of urgency that Mason had trained himself to recognize, and this one had it. I need to step away for a minute, he said to Ava, and climbed down. He walked to the tree line at the edge of the yard, out of easy earshot. Board's asking questions, Carl said. He didn't waste time on preamble. Neither of them did, usually. The Clover Ridge timeline has been pending for 6 weeks. Reinhardt specifically asked me at the regional call this morning what's happening with the Harper property. I didn't have a good answer. Thomas Reinhardt was Sterling Logistics' largest outside investor. And the man who had, 3 years ago, made the Clover Ridge development possible by committing the capital that made the project's scale viable. He was not a patient man. He was not a man who appreciated vague answers, and he had never in Mason's experience accepted we're working on it as a status update. "What did you tell him?" Mason said. "I said acquisition was ongoing, and we anticipated resolution within the quarter." A pause. "Mason, that's not going to hold much longer." Mason looked back at the farmhouse. Ava had climbed up on the roof herself and was holding the metal sheet in place, waiting for him. "I know," he said. "The timeline we gave the county for the project permits is already stretched. If we don't close on that last parcel—" "I know, Carl." A silence on the line. Carl had been with him long enough to read silences. "How complicated is this?" he asked. Mason watched Ava on the roof, holding a sheet of metal roofing in the July heat, waiting without impatience because impatience cost energy she didn't have to waste. "I'll talk to Reinhardt," Mason said. "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." Another pause. "Okay," Carl said. He didn't sound satisfied. He sounded like a man who was good at his job and could see a problem developing and was doing the math on what it would cost. "Okay, let me know when you're ready to talk timeline." Mason put the phone in his pocket and walked back to the ladder. "Everything okay?" Ava asked from the roof. "Work thing," he said. She looked at him with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. "You can take care of it if you need to." "It can wait," he said, and climbed back up the ladder. He told himself this was true. The problem was that by telling himself it could wait, he was also telling himself something he didn't fully examine, that there would be a natural moment, a right time, to sit down with Ava and tell her the full shape of what he'd been carrying since he drove down that gravel lane for the first time. That there would be the conversation that resolved the tension between who he was coming to be on this farm and who he still was in the boardroom with the quarterly projections and the investor obligations and a project that had 63 acres of her family's land as a necessary component. He kept not having that conversation. It was not entirely cowardice. Some of it was that he genuinely didn't know yet what he intended to do, and he didn't want to say anything to her until he did. He thought of himself as a man who didn't make promises he couldn't keep, and he was not going to make her a promise until he knew it was one he could stand behind. But some of it was cowardice. He knew that too. The weeks blurred into each other in a way that felt different from the usual blur of his life, which was the blur of full schedules and back-to-back decisions, and days that went from early to late without gaps. This was a different kind of blur, softer somehow, or maybe more textured, more specific. He could tell you what had happened on any given day at the farm in a way he couldn't tell you what had happened on most days in the boardroom. The days at the farm left marks. He and Ava fell into routines without discussing them. Coffee when he arrived, made by whoever got to the kitchen first. Tools in the workshop at the end of the day, put back the way she kept them. Lunch on the tailgate or on the porch steps depending on where they'd been working. Easy silences that weren't uncomfortable and conversation that didn't fill space for the sake of filling it. They talked when they had something to say and didn't when they didn't. He learned that she was funny in a dry, quiet way that you could miss if you weren't paying attention. She made observations about things. The goat, the tractor, the particular behavior of the chickens in hot weather, that were precise and deadpan and occasionally made him laugh out loud, which surprised her each time, a small surprised pleasure on her face that she didn't perform or amplify. She learned that he was a worse cook than anyone his age had a right to be, and that he knew this and was unembarrassed by it. She let him try once, though. He'd offered to make dinner after a long workday, confident enough. And the result was edible in a technical sense, and she ate it with a neutral expression that told him nothing. But when he asked how it was, she said, "It tastes like someone who's never cooked without someone else watching," which was so accurate it was almost impressive. "That's fair," he said. "You can help me instead of cooking," she offered. "That's probably better for everyone." He helped her instead. He turned out to be a good prep cook, methodical, precise, didn't improvise when he wasn't sure what to do. And the kitchen worked when they were in it together in a way it hadn't worked when he was in it alone. They made something with the vegetables from her garden and the chicken she'd raised, and it was the best meal he'd had in years. And he didn't say that out loud because saying it would require explaining why. and explaining why would open a conversation he wasn't ready to have at the kitchen table over dinner. Sophie asked, on one of the later Tuesdays, if she could have the room next to Biscuit's pasture. Mason looked up from the fence he was mending. Ava looked up from the row she was hoeing in the kitchen garden. Sophie had been touring the barn with the systematic interest she brought to everything and had identified a small storage room off the main barn as the ideal location for what she was now describing as her farm space. "That's where I keep the winter equipment," Ava said. "We could move it," Sophie said. "There's room in the other part." "Sophie," Mason said. "I'm just saying it's a good room," Sophie said. She had her arms crossed in the position she took when she had an argument prepared. "It has a window, and it's near Biscuit, and when we come here I don't have anywhere to put my stuff." "You have your backpack," Mason said. "That's not a place," Sophie said, with the absolute clarity of a child identifying an adult who is missing the point. There was a silence. Ava looked at Sophie, then at Mason, then back at Sophie. She was doing the calculation of what this moment required. Not the big calculation, not what Sophie's request meant in the context of everything, but the immediate small human one, the one that asked what a 6-year-old needed to hear right now. "Come here," Ava said, and put the hoe down. She walked Sophie to the storage room. Mason followed far enough behind to not be in the conversation. He could hear Ava's voice through the barn wall, low and even, and Sophie's voice responding, and then a longer quiet that sounded like an agreement being reached, though he couldn't make out the specifics. They came out. Sophie looked mollified. Ava came back to her garden row, picked up the hoe, and resumed working. "What did you tell her?" Mason asked, keeping his voice low. Ava didn't look up from the hoe. "I told her we could find a box for her things and keep it in the barn so she had somewhere to put them." He was quiet a moment. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Ava." "She's 6, Mason." She turned a length of soil easy and practiced. "She's 6 years old and she likes it here. Let her have a box." He watched her work. The way she moved through the garden was the same way she moved through everything on this farm, with the ease of someone who had learned the land by doing it, whose body knew the work before her mind finished planning it. "She's not the only one who likes it here," he said. Ava kept hoeing. She didn't answer for a long moment. A bird called somewhere in the oaks. The afternoon heat pressed down. "I know that too," she said quietly. Neither of them said anything else. The quality of the silence between them had changed by then. They both felt it without naming it. There was a charge in the ordinary moments, passing tools, eating lunch, standing close over a piece of equipment, that hadn't been there in the beginning, or that had been there but smaller, early static, rather than something with weather in it. They had not done anything about it. Mason had not tried and Ava had not invited, and that restraint was mutual and deliberate and spoke to something they both understood without discussing, that there were things that needed resolving first, that the farm and the company and the valley were still between them, unchanged, like a door left open in winter. You can pretend not to feel the draft, but the cold keeps coming in. He drove home on a Friday evening in late August with Sophie asleep in the back seat, the same way she'd fallen asleep the first time, her head against the window. The valley road glowed in the headlights. He turned onto the highway and watched the farm lane disappear in the mirror, and he thought about what he hadn't told Ava, and what Carl had said, and what Reinhardt was going to want to hear next week, and the board presentation with its timelines and its targets. He thought about Ava's face the evening the pump came on, that unguarded relief. He thought about Sophie's box of things in the barn. He thought about the east fence, solid now and properly done, and how it had looked that morning when he'd walked it and found no weakness in any post, no sag in any wire. Something was going to have to give. He knew that. He'd known it for a while. But knowing something has to give and knowing what to do about it were two different things, and he was still in the gap between them, driving home through the dark, with his daughter sleeping and the farm in his rearview mirror and the company in his phone and no clean answer anywhere he looked. He drove. The night was quiet. The highway was nearly empty. Somewhere behind him, in the barn, there was a cardboard box with Sophie's name written on it in Ava's handwriting. Neat, practical, the letters of someone who did not put unnecessary ornament on things. And inside it was a library book about goats, a drawing of biscuit, and a handful of smooth rocks from the creek bed that Sophie had collected over the last 3 weeks, carrying them back from each visit because she liked their weight. Keeping things somewhere means planning to come back. He drove a little faster. He had a decision to make. He could feel it coming the way you feel weather coming in the valley. Before you see anything, before anything has changed, just a different pressure in the air, a shift in how the light sits. He didn't know yet what the decision would be, but he knew it was coming, and he knew, driving through the August dark, that he was going to have to make it before someone else made it for him. The weather changed the first week of September in the way it always did in Clover Ridge Valley. Not gradually, not with warning, but overnight. One morning it was summer, and the next it wasn't, and the hills went from deep green to something edged with gold almost between one look and the next. The air thinned out. The mornings got their bite back. Ava had always loved the valley in early fall. Her father had loved it too, and they'd had a tradition, she and Robert Harper, of walking the property line on the first cool morning of the season. Just walking it, no tools, no agenda, just the two of them going around the boundary of what they had together. She'd done it alone the past 2 Septembers, and it was one of the few rituals she'd kept that felt more like grief than habit, the kind of thing you keep doing because stopping it means admitting something you're not ready to admit. She did it alone again this year, early on a Thursday before Mason was due to come out. The dew was still heavy on the grass, and the oaks were just beginning to think about turning, and the whole valley had the smell of season change, which was one of those smells that meant something different to everyone, and to Ava meant home in a way that nothing else did. She walked the east fence, solid, the new post clean in the morning light, and the south field with its improved drainage, and up past the upper pasture where the grass was long and untouched. She stood at the northeast corner of the property where the old stone wall her great-grandfather had built ran into the tree line, and she put her hand on the stones the way she always did, the particular cold weight of them, the irregular texture. She thought about Mason. She'd been trying not to do that with any regularity because it wasn't productive, and because there were things unresolved between them that made the thinking complicated rather than simple. But the honest truth, and Ava was constitutionally incapable of sustaining dishonesty with herself for very long, was that she thought about him often, and the thoughts had a warmth to them that she didn't know what to do with. He was supposed to be the person coming to take this from her. That was the original shape of it. The company, the project, the development that would turn this valley into a logistics hub and put a distribution center where the Kowalskis had grown wheat for 30 years. Mason Sterling had come down that gravel lane as the representative of that future, and she'd known it, and she'd been on guard against it. But the man who kept showing up on Tuesdays and Thursdays with work gloves and coffee wasn't easy to keep at arm's length when he was the same person helping with the water pump in the dark and taking the tractor to Millhaven and writing Sophie's name on a cardboard box in the barn. He'd made himself real to her in the most inconvenient way possible, through small, consistent, unglamorous acts that couldn't be explained away as performance. She walked back to the farmhouse. The coffee was still hot on the stove. She poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the elderberry branches in the mason jar, dried out now. She hadn't replaced them. She was going to have to ask him directly. She'd been circling it, putting it off, telling herself there wasn't a right moment. But there wasn't going to be a right moment. There was just going to be the moment she made. She heard his truck on the gravel lane at 8:15. He came in the way he did now, through the back door, which she'd stopped locking during the day. He had coffee from Millhaven. He still brought it, even though the farm coffee was fine. She thought maybe it was just something he needed to do. And he was wearing the work jacket he'd started keeping in his truck specifically for farm days, and he looked like a man who was somewhere he wanted to be. And that was the hardest thing about all of it. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. She looked at him steadily. He read something in her expression because he set the coffee down and didn't immediately start talking about the day's work. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing's wrong," she said. "I need to ask you something." "Okay. And I need you to answer me straight, not carefully. Not the way you answer when you're thinking about how the answer will land." He was quiet for a moment. She could see him deciding something, the choice between the careful version and the real one. "Okay," he said again. "What is your company planning to do if I don't sell?" The kitchen was very quiet. The fan wasn't on. The morning was still enough that there was no wind against the windows. "There's an active foreclosure proceeding with the bank," he said. "If it goes through, our legal team has an acquisition framework ready to move with the bank directly. We would purchase the property from them in lieu of the foreclosure sale." He paused. "That's what the plan currently says." She absorbed this. It was not a surprise, not exactly, but hearing it stated plainly still landed like something heavy being set down. "So the farm goes either way," she said. "That's what the current plan says," he said again, and she noticed the specific repetition. He was saying current plan like it was something that could be changed, and that was deliberate, and she didn't know yet what to do with the deliberateness. "How long have you known that?" she asked. "Since before I came out here the first time." She looked at him. "I know," he said. "I know what that looks like." "Do you?" "Ava." "Because what it looks like," she said, and her voice was even, which took effort, "is that you came out here with the full picture and I didn't have it. You sat at my kitchen table and drank my coffee and helped with my fence and let me think we were having one kind of conversation when we were actually having a different one. I wasn't—" He stopped, started again. "When I came out that first time, I thought it was going to be a straightforward meeting. Look at the property, talk numbers, move on. And then it wasn't, and then it kept not being that." He ran a hand through his hair, the restless gesture she'd seen him make when he was working something out. "I kept thinking I'd figure out what I was doing before I said anything, that I'd have a real answer before I put the real question on the table." "And do you have a real answer?" A long pause. Long enough that she felt it. "Not yet," he said. She turned and looked out the window. The yard was quiet, the upper pasture visible over the barn roof, the gold green of early fall on the hills beyond it. 3 generations. The stone wall at the northeast corner. Her father's hands on the same stones. "You need to understand something," she said, still looking out the window. "This isn't just a negotiation I'm losing. This is— my whole family is in this ground. My father died on this property. My grandfather is buried in the east corner under the big oak, which is apparently inside your access corridor." She turned back to him. "Did your site maps tell you that?" Something crossed his face. "No," he said quietly, "because I didn't put it in the property description because I didn't think it mattered. He's under a fieldstone marker, no official record, just family." She kept her voice even. "I'm telling you now." Mason sat down. He sat down at the kitchen table like the weight of that information had pushed him there, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "Ava," he said, "I'm not saying it to make you feel bad," she said. "I'm saying it so you understand what this actually is, what you're actually asking for." "I know," he said, and then lower. "I don't know what to do. That's the second time you've said that to me. It keeps being true." She sat down across from him. They were at the same table they'd sat at the first day he came, over 2 months ago now, and the quality of the silence between them was completely different than it had been then. Then it had been the silence of strangers being careful. Now it was the silence of 2 people who knew each other well enough that the silences had content. "Tell me what you're working through," she said. Not the company answer, the real one. He was quiet for a long moment. "The project is real," he said finally. 400 jobs in a county that needs them. A rail connection that would lower shipping costs for every agricultural operation within 100 miles. Infrastructure that's been planned for 3 years and has investors and county approvals and a timeline that people have built their lives around. He paused. "That's all real, and I can't pretend it isn't, and I'm not going to. Okay? And this—" He gestured, a gesture that meant the farm and everything in it. "This is also real. The 3 generations and the stone wall and your grandfather under the oak and what your father put into this place. That's real too." "So what do you do when 2 real things are in the same space?" she said. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." She looked at him for a long moment. "Figure it out soon," she said. Not angry, not cold, just honest, the way she was about everything. "Because I can't keep being in this thing between us, whatever this is, without knowing what it's sitting on top of." He met her eyes. "I know," he said. "Okay," she said. She got up and picked up her coffee. The north barn roof needs looking at today, she said. The seam above the hayloft is showing rust. I've got the supplies. He stood up. He picked up the Millhaven coffee he'd brought and handed it to her as he passed. She took it. They went to work. That was the last ordinary week. The thing that broke it open wasn't Mason and wasn't Ava and wasn't even the project itself. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-September when the Millhaven Courier, which was the county's twice-weekly paper and had a readership of roughly 4,000 people and a website that got more traffic than it deserved, ran a front-page story with the headline, "Sterling Logistics Project Would Reshape Clover Ridge Valley. Who Wins and Who Loses?" The reporter was a woman named Diane Chu, who had been covering Millhaven for 12 years and was one of the better small-market journalists in the state, which meant she was thorough and fair and deeply inconvenient to anyone who had been hoping a story stayed quiet. She had obtained the project site maps through a county records request. She had interviewed 6 of the landowners who'd sold. She had spoken to the County Economic Development Office, to a transportation consultant out of the state capital, and to a former Sterling Logistics employee who described the company's acquisition strategy in terms that were accurate and not flattering. The story named the Harper farm specifically. It named the debt. It named the foreclosure proceeding. It quoted an unnamed source close to the project saying the final acquisition was expected to close before the end of the year. Ava found out about it the way most people found out about things in Millhaven. Someone called her. In this case, it was Linda Kowalski, whose family had sold the south parcel 4 months ago and who called at 6:50 in the morning before Ava had finished her first coffee. "Have you seen the Courier?" Linda asked. Ava had not seen the Courier. She pulled it up on her phone while Linda was still talking. She read the headline. She read the first 3 paragraphs. She read the part about the unnamed source. She read the part about the Harper farm. "Ava, you there?" "I'm here," Ava said. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," she said, the automatic answer, the one that meant she needed to get off the phone and think. "Thank you for calling, Linda." She put the phone down. She read the rest of the article. By 9 in the morning, her phone had rung 4 more times. A neighbor from 2 properties over, a woman from the County Historical Preservation Committee who'd read the story online, a reporter from a paper in the city asking for comment, and her attorney, whose voice had the careful tone of someone who was about to tell her that something had changed. "The story's getting picked up," her attorney said. "Regional Wire picked it up around 8. You're going to start hearing from people." "What people?" "People who want the project, people who don't. People who want to make this into a larger story about land rights and corporate development." A pause. "And the county commissioner's office. They called me about the town meeting." "What town meeting?" "There's a county-level public comment meeting scheduled for 3 weeks from now. It's been on the books, but it was procedural before. Now, given the coverage, it's going to be something different. The commissioner wants affected parties to speak, including you." Ava stood at the kitchen window in the same spot she'd stood most mornings for the last 18 months, looking at the same yard, the same barn, the same upper pasture. "Okay," she said. "Ava, I need you to think carefully about—" "I said okay," she said. "I'll be there." She called Mason. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already at his phone, which meant he'd probably already seen it. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "The unnamed source. I don't know who it was. Carl, maybe, or someone in legal. I didn't—" A pause. "It wasn't me." "I know it wasn't you," she said. She did know that. That particular source had spoken about the acquisition strategy in the clinical language of someone inside a deal room, not in the language of someone who'd spent 3 months learning which fence was the east fence. "But it's out there now." "Yes." "There's a town meeting in 3 weeks. A beat. "I know. My office got the notice this morning. Are you going to be there?" "Yes." "Okay," she said. She hung up. She went to work, because there was always work, and the work didn't care what was in the newspaper. The 3 weeks between the article and the town meeting were the strangest weeks of Ava's life, and that was saying something given the 18 months that had preceded them. The story continued to circulate online, growing as stories do when they touch something people already feel strongly about, the question of who gets to own land and what happens to the people on it when the math of development comes for them. Her phone was unmanageable for the first week. She stopped answering numbers she didn't recognize, which meant she probably missed some calls she should have taken and definitely avoided several she was glad to miss. Mason kept coming out. That surprised her a little, though she'd tried not to show it. The Tuesday after the article, he pulled down the lane at 8:15, the same as always, same coffee, same work jacket, and when she looked at him from the porch, he looked back at her with an expression that said, "I'm still here," without saying it out loud. They didn't talk about the article. They talked about the north barn roof, which they were still working on, and a repair to the chicken coop that had been on the list for a month, and whether the upper pasture needed to be cut before winter. Normal conversation. Working conversation. The kind that means you're still occupying the same space and intend to keep doing so. But underneath it, there was the town meeting, getting closer, and the unnamed source's words still sitting in the newspaper, and the thing Ava and Mason had between them that still didn't have a name or a resolution. She asked him on the Thursday before the meeting what he was going to say. They were in the barn. She was sorting through equipment for winter storage, which involved moving things from the workshop to the main barn and reassessing what needed servicing. Mason was helping her move a hay tiller that was heavier than it looked and did not want to go where they needed it to go. "At the meeting," she said, grunting slightly against the weight of the thing. "What are you going to say?" "I haven't decided," he said. "You should decide before you get there." "I know." They got the tiller into position. He straightened up, rubbing his lower back, which made her notice that she'd been making him lift things without much consideration for the fact that he wasn't 22 and farm conditioned. She filed that away as something she'd probably feel bad about later. "I'm working through something," he said, "about the project." She looked at him. "I can't tell you what it is yet because it's not solid yet," he said, "but I need you to know that I'm working on it." "That's the third time you've said something like that to me," she said. "That you're working on it. That you don't know yet." "I know. At some point, I know, Ava." His voice had more weight in it than usual. "I know I've been slow with this. I know what that's cost you." He paused. "I'm asking for a little more time." She looked at him for a long moment. The barn was quiet, the smell of hay and machine oil around them, a particular shaft of afternoon light coming through the high window at the hayloft. She thought about the stone wall and her grandfather's grave and the box of smooth rocks in the corner of the barn with Sophie's name on it. She thought about what it felt like to have someone in your space who understood the difference between your property and your home. "Okay," she said. Last time that word had been almost yes. This time it was hanging by a thread. He saw that. She could tell he saw it. "Thank you," he said quietly. The Millhaven Town Meeting was held in the County Civic Center, which was a beige building from the 1970s with inadequate parking and an HVAC system that struggled in any weather. It seated about 200 people. On the night of the meeting, more than 300 showed up, and they brought with them the specific charged energy of people who have been waiting for an official place to say what they've been saying in their kitchens and driveways for weeks. Ava got there early and sat in the third row. Her attorney was beside her. She'd worn her good boots, the ones she kept for occasions that required not looking like she'd just come from the field, and the jacket her father had given her the last Christmas he was alive, which was dark green canvas and fit her well and made her feel irrationally but consistently like she was standing on solid ground. The room filled. She recognized most of the faces. This was her county. These were her neighbors. Linda Kowalski was near the back with her husband. The Hendersons, who'd sold, were near the middle. She saw farmers and contractors and people from town, shop owners and school board members, and the woman from the Historical Preservation Committee who had called her the morning the article ran. She also saw Thomas Reinhardt. She didn't know who he was at first, just a man in an expensive suit who arrived with two other men in expensive suits and sat in the far-right section with the deliberate arrangement of people who consider themselves observers rather than participants. Her attorney leaned over and identified him quietly. Sterling Logistics primary investor. She looked at him once, got a general impression of a man who calculated everything including how he sat in a room, and looked away. Mason came in near the start. He was alone. No Carl, no entourage, none of the legal team. He was in a jacket and slacks, not his work clothes, but not the full corporate presentation either. He saw her. He held her look for a moment, something passing between them that was too complex to name, and then he sat on the opposite side of the room, which was the seat of someone who had not yet decided which side he was on. She noted that. She did not feel good about it. The meeting started with the county commissioner, a steady-voiced woman named Patricia Gaines, who had held the office for 11 years and managed the specific tone of a person who has moderated enough public meetings to know when a room is ready to ignite. She went through the procedural matters, the project overview, the economic impact assessment, the timeline for the permits, in a calm voice that was doing the maximum of what calm voices can do. Then she opened the floor. The first several speakers were in favor of the project: a contractor from Millhaven who talked about the construction jobs, a representative from the County Economic Development Office who cited the 400 permanent positions and the projected tax revenue, a man who owned a trucking company in the next county over and talked about the infrastructure benefits in terms that were specific and coherent. Then the balance shifted. A woman named Carol Marsh, who had farmed the valley for 40 years, talked about what the valley had been and what it would become. She didn't raise her voice. She used numbers and names and the specific language of someone who had watched too many things she loved get optimized out of existence. The room was very quiet while she spoke. Then a man Ava didn't know stood up and said that it was convenient that the one holdout farmer in the valley had apparently spent the summer getting cozy with the CEO of the company trying to take her land, and the room's temperature changed instantly. Ava felt it, the shift in how people looked at her. Not everyone, not even most of the room. But enough. The insinuation was out there now, visible, the way insinuations become visible once they're said in a room with 300 people in it. Her attorney put a hand briefly on her arm. Patricia Gaines called for decorum. Ava stood up. She hadn't planned to speak yet. She'd planned to wait until her designated time, the slot her attorney had arranged, when she could speak from prepared notes in a controlled context. But she was on her feet before the decision was fully formed, and then she was speaking, and the room was listening. "My name is Ava Harper," she said. "My family has farmed 63 acres in this valley for 3 generations. I'm here because I'm the last person in this county whose land is being acquired for a project that I was not consulted about, that I did not agree to, and that will put a distribution center on top of my grandfather's grave." She paused. Let the room take that. "I did not sell. I am not selling. And I am asking this commission and everyone in this room to consider whether 400 jobs in exchange for erasing 3 generations of a family's entire history is a trade we're actually comfortable calling progress." She sat down. The room was quiet for 2 seconds. Then it wasn't. Several people applauded. Several others didn't. The man who'd made the insinuation about her and Mason said something to the person next to him. Patricia Gaines called for order. In the far right section, Reinhardt leaned over to one of the men beside him and said something quiet. Ava did not look at Mason. She was keeping her eyes forward, her hands folded in her lap, her expression controlled. She was doing the thing her father had taught her by example. Hold your ground without holding your breath, because holding your breath means you're waiting for it to be over, and sometimes things take longer than one breath. 3 more speakers. A man from the State Farmland Preservation Advocacy, a county school board member who wanted to talk about tax base implications, a young woman who'd grown up in the valley and moved away and was now, she said, watching from the internet as the place that made her feel rooted got turned into a supply chain node. Then Patricia Gaines looked at the right side of the room and said, "Mr. Sterling, I understand you have some remarks." Mason stood. He was aware of 300 pairs of eyes, and he'd been in rooms with more than that. He'd spoken to boards and investors and press conferences. He'd given speeches and delivered bad news and presented numbers that made grown men sweat. He was not usually nervous about rooms. He was nervous about this room. Not about the room, exactly. About one person in the room. He'd been watching Ava from across the aisle for the last 2 hours, and he'd watched the man's insinuation land on her, and watched her face go controlled and careful in the way it went when she was absorbing something that cost her more than she wanted to show. He looked at his notes. 3 pages prepared by Carl and the communications team, careful and balanced and politically functional, the kind of statement that would neither fully endorse the project nor fully distance him from it, the kind of statement designed to keep all options open. He folded the notes once. He put them in his jacket pocket. The Clover Ridge Valley Development Project, he said, is a genuine economic opportunity for this county. The jobs are real. The infrastructure benefits are real. I'm not going to stand here and tell you they aren't, because that would be dishonest, and this room deserves honesty. He paused. What I will tell you is that I've spent the last 3 months on this land, on this specific land, in this specific valley, and on the Harper farm in particular. And I've learned things that didn't show up in any site assessment or property valuation. The room was very quiet. I've learned that this valley isn't just a geographic feature. It's 3 generations of families who built something specific here, who knew something specific about this place, and who have a claim on it that doesn't fit into an acquisition framework. He paused. And I want to be honest with this room that I have not yet figured out how to reconcile what this project requires with what this valley deserves. He sat down. The room erupted, not uniformly. Nothing in a room of 300 is uniform. But the noise was immediate and complicated. Applause from some quarters, shouted objections from others, Patricia Gaines calling for order with increasing firmness. Reinhardt was speaking rapidly to his associates. Carl, who had come in late and been standing near the back, had an expression on his face that Mason had never seen before, a kind of controlled alarm that meant he was calculating the damage and it was coming out large. Ava finally looked at Mason. She had heard what he said. She had heard the careful balance of it. He'd told the truth about the project, and he'd told the truth about what he'd learned, and he had said he hadn't figured out the reconciliation yet, which was honest, which was exactly the kind of honesty he'd shown her at the kitchen table the first day. I don't know. I don't know that either. But he had not said he would stop. He had not chosen, not publicly, not in the way the room needed. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and she could see that he knew. He knew what he hadn't done, what he'd stopped short of. And his expression carried the specific look of a man who has done something and can already see exactly where it fell short. Reinhardt stood up from his seat. He did not wait to be called on. He was not a man who waited to be called on. With respect to everyone in this room, he said, and the way he said with respect made it clear respect was not the primary concern. Sterling Logistics has contractual obligations, county approvals, and investor commitments that represent a binding framework. Individual leadership sentiment about the value of agricultural land does not alter those obligations. He looked at Mason with the flat directness of a man reminding another man what he owes. This company is going to complete this project. Patricia Gaines said his name in a warning tone. Reinhardt sat down. The room was loud again. Ava stood up. Not to speak this time, to leave. She picked up her bag and she said something to her attorney, something brief, and she walked toward the aisle. Mason was on his feet without deciding to be. Ava. She looked at him. I need to talk to you, he said. The room was still noise around them. 300 people, and the echo of what Reinhardt had said, and the particular weight of everything they hadn't said to each other over 3 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays. You had the chance to talk, she said. Her voice wasn't raised. It wasn't cold exactly. It was the voice of someone who has been carrying a specific hope carefully for a long time and has just felt it slip. I know, he said. You stood up in front of this whole county and said you haven't figured it out yet. She held his look. I've been waiting for you to figure it out, Mason. I've been patient. I've let you in. A pause. The room noise was starting to become aware of them. She didn't look at the room. And you still didn't choose. Ava, I know what it means when a man knows what's right and still says he hasn't figured it out. She picked up the jacket strap on her shoulder. It means he's already figured it out, and he just doesn't like the answer. She walked out. He stood in the aisle of the Millhaven County Civic Center with 300 people around him and the noise of the meeting still happening, and Carl's face visible near the back door carrying that expression of controlled alarm, and Reinhardt watching from the right section with the specific composure of a man who has just seen a problem become less complicated. Mason stood there. He didn't follow her. He should have followed her. He knew that even as he wasn't doing it, knew that the not following was another choice in the sequence of choices he kept making that all fell one step short. He looked at the empty seat in the third row. He looked at the green canvas jacket gone through the door. He thought about a morning on Route 9 before he knew her name. A woman who fixed his tire and refused his money and drove away without looking back. And how he'd stood on that shoulder watching the pickup truck until it disappeared around the curve and thought about it for days. He thought about Sophie's box of smooth rocks in the barn. He thought about what it cost to keep not deciding and who ends up paying for it. Carl appeared beside him. "We need to talk," Carl said, in the tone of someone who means immediately. "I know," Mason said. He looked at the door Ava had walked through. Outside, he knew she was already on the road, back toward the valley, back toward the farm, back toward everything she'd built and everything she was trying to hold on to and everything she'd let him close enough to see. He thought about what she'd said. It means he's already figured it out and he just doesn't like the answer. She wasn't wrong. He'd known for a while. He'd been calling it uncertainty because uncertainty was easier than the word that was actually true, which was that he'd known what he had to do and had been standing at the edge of it, measuring the drop, and he'd kept measuring instead of jumping. "Mason," Carl said. "Give me a minute," Mason said. He stood there in the civic center with the noise of the meeting around him and the cold night outside and the drive to the valley that he knew by heart now, every turn, every landmark, the mailbox with the barely legible numbers, the lane between the oaks. He stood there. And for the first time in 3 months of slow decisions and careful phrasing and choosing words that kept all options open, something in him stopped measuring and started moving toward the edge. He just needed to get there. He just needed to go. He wasn't ready. He still didn't fully like the answer, but he was going to do it anyway. He didn't sleep that night. He drove back to the city after the meeting, Carl in the passenger seat, mostly silent, which was unusual for Carl. And the 2-hour drive went the way drives go when you're not really there for them, when the road is just the space between where you were and where you have to be next. Carl waited until they were on the highway before he said anything. "Reinhardt called me," he said. "I know he did. He's not, Mason, he's not angry yet. He's in the mode before angry, the one where he's still calculating whether he can work with what happened." A pause. "But if we don't give him something concrete in the next 72 hours, I know. The project timeline, Carl," he said it quietly. "I know." Carl went back to his phone. The highway ran through the dark. Mason drove. He thought about what Ava had said. It means he's already figured it out and he just doesn't like the answer. He turned that over the whole 2 hours. He was still turning it over when he pulled into the parking structure under his building, cut the engine, and sat in the quiet for a while. The answer he'd figured out, the one he didn't like, had the shape of something enormous and irreversible. It was the shape of a decision that you could not walk back and could not qualify and could not phrase carefully to keep options open. It was the shape of a real thing, which was exactly why he'd been measuring it for weeks instead of doing it. He rode the elevator up to his floor. The apartment was quiet. His mother had stayed with Sophie, and they were both asleep, the place dark except for the kitchen light she always left on. He stood in the kitchen for a while. He made coffee he didn't drink. He sat at his own kitchen table, different kitchen, a view of the city instead of a yard with a goat. And he thought about the Clover Ridge project from its beginning. He'd been 28 when the idea first formed. His father had started Sterling Logistics as a regional operation, 15 trucks, a warehouse in the city, a handshake network of clients who liked dealing with a man they knew personally. Mason had inherited a company doing $60 million a year, which was enough to be stable and not enough to be safe. And he'd spent his first 3 years on modernization and infrastructure and losing the clients Carl's father had built in the process, just like he'd told Ava. The Clover Ridge project was his own. His vision, his planning, his 3 years of assembling parcels and securing county approvals and convincing Reinhardt to put in the capital that made it real. He thought about it as the thing that proved he was more than just the man who'd inherited something. He sat with that for a while. He thought about what it meant that he'd built it and what it meant to unmake it. He thought about Ava's face at the kitchen table the first day. This land is not a parcel. It's all of them. He thought about the east fence and the water pump and the tractor he'd driven 40 minutes each way to Mill Haven at a speed that made a teenager honk in solidarity. He thought about his daughter asleep in the next room, who had smooth rocks in a box with her name on it in a barn in Clover Ridge Valley, and who had chosen that box herself without being asked. He thought about his own father, the handshake version of Sterling Logistics, the clients who wanted the personal and not the corporate. He'd always understood that version as something that needed to evolve, to grow, to become the larger thing. He'd been right about that, but he'd spent so much time building the larger thing that he'd stopped asking whether the larger thing was built on the right foundation or whether the foundation was the people inside the project or the people under the tires. He got up and went to Sophie's room. She was asleep on her side, her dark hair across the pillow, one arm wrapped around the stuffed bear she'd had since she was 18 months old. The bear was called Bear. Sophie had strong opinions about naming things what they were. He stood in the doorway. He'd stood in a lot of doorways over the last 4 years, watching her sleep, and the feeling it produced was never simple. There was love, obviously, the overwhelming kind, the kind that rewrites your entire understanding of what the word means. But there was also the specific grief of a parent doing this alone. The absence of someone to look at in these moments, to exchange the quiet look with, to share the weight of being the only one watching. He'd carried that alone for 4 years. He'd gotten used to it the way you get used to things that don't actually get easier. You just build the muscle for it. He thought about the farm kitchen, the specific quality of an evening there, after a day's work, sitting on the porch steps with cold water and the valley going blue in the dusk. He thought about not being alone in those moments. He thought about what it had felt like to have a specific someone to look at across the tailgate at lunch and not need to explain anything. He went back to the kitchen. He got out a legal pad. He was not a legal pad person usually. He worked on screens and in documents, but some decisions needed paper. He wrote down the numbers, the project numbers, what the cancellation would cost, what the contractual penalties would be, what the investor settlement would require. He wrote down the Reinhardt conversation that needed to happen, and the board conversation, and the county conversation, and the conversations with the landowners who'd already sold in expectation of the project proceeding. He looked at the numbers for a long time. They were large. They were the kind of large that made his financial team's eyes go wide, the kind that would require restructuring, the kind that would strip the company back down to a scale it hadn't operated at in years. Not to nothing. The company was solid enough, diversified enough, that it would survive. But it would be a different company. Smaller. Slower. The version of Sterling Logistics that his father might actually have recognized. He thought, maybe that's not the worst thing. He wrote one more thing on the legal pad. Not a number. A name. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but he slept some, and when his alarm went off at 5:30, he got up, made coffee, and called Carl. "I need to meet with Reinhardt today," he said. "I can set that up," Carl said carefully. "What do you want me to tell him it's about?" "Tell him I've made a decision about Clover Ridge." A pause on the line. "Mason, set up the meeting, Carl." Another pause. Longer. "Okay," Carl said. The Reinhardt meeting was at 10 o'clock in the Sterling Logistics boardroom, which was on the 22nd floor and had a view of the city that Mason had always found clarifying. Reinhardt arrived with one associate, which meant he was treating this as a negotiation, not a confrontation. He was in a charcoal suit, and he had the composure of a man who had been in many difficult rooms and come out of all of them in a satisfactory position. Carl was present. Mason's CFO was present, at Mason's request. Mason sat at the head of the table and put the legal pad in front of him and looked at Reinhardt directly. "I'm canceling the Clover Ridge project," he said. The room went very quiet. Reinhardt didn't move. He had a particular skill for stillness in moments of impact. Mason had seen it before, in negotiations, the way he absorbed information without showing the processing of it. "That's not a decision you can make unilaterally," he said. "The investment agreement, I've reviewed the agreement with legal this morning," Mason said. "The cancellation penalty is significant. I'm prepared to pay it." He slid a document across the table. The settlement calculation, prepared by his CFO at 5 in the morning. "The company absorbs the penalty. We settle your position at the agreed liquidation terms, and we restructure the remaining operations to reflect the reduced scope." Reinhardt looked at the document. He picked it up. His face did something brief and controlled. "This is a substantial loss." "Yes." You've built this project for 3 years. Yes. Because of one farm. He said it flat, not quite a question. Because I was wrong about something, Mason said. The project was built on the assumption that you can calculate the value of a place and acquisition costs and economic impact assessments. I've spent 3 months finding out that assumption was wrong, and I'm not going to keep running a project that I know is built on a wrong assumption just because the financial consequences of stopping are uncomfortable. Reinhardt set the document down. He looked at Mason for a long moment with the expression of a man who is recalculating. Not the finances, he had people for that, but something else, something closer to assessment. I've backed you for 6 years, he said. I've never questioned a call you've made. I know. I'm questioning this one. I know that too. Mason held his look. And I'm making it anyway. Another silence. The city was visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows, 22 floors of it, and the scale of that view had always made Mason feel the size of things in a useful way. Right now it just felt like altitude. Reinhardt sat back. The county approvals, he said. The landowners who've already sold. The contractors who bid the work. You understand the downstream effects of this. I've thought about them. And they're real, and I'm responsible for them, and the company will address each one individually through legal settlement. Mason paused. I'm not pretending this doesn't cost other people. It does. And that's on me. But the alternative is completing a project that I know, damages something that cannot be compensated through market rate acquisition. Reinhardt picked up the settlement document again. He read through it slowly. His associate was taking notes. The CFO was very still in the way that financial people go still when very large numbers are being decided. You'll need to notify the county today, Reinhardt said finally. I know. And the other landowners. My team is already preparing the notifications. Reinhardt looked at him one more time. Whatever he was looking for, he either found it or decided it wasn't going to appear. Fine, he said. He set the document down. Get me the formal settlement terms by end of week. He stood. His associate gathered papers. He paused at the door and looked back at Mason with an expression that was complicated. Not warm, not cold. Something between respect and the specific weariness of a man who has seen someone do something expensive for reasons he doesn't quite follow but won't argue with. I hope she's worth it, Reinhardt said. It's not about her, Mason said. It's about being able to live with myself. Reinhardt looked at him one more beat, then he left. Carl let out a long breath. Okay, he said. He sounded like a man who has just watched something fall from a great height and is still processing whether it broke. Okay, what do we do first? The county commissioner, Mason said. Call Patricia Gaines, tell her we're requesting a meeting today if possible, and get me the Harper property file. Carl picked up his phone. And Carl, Mason said. He said it without looking up from the legal pad. The debt on the Harper property, the full amount. Who holds it? A pause. The foreclosure proceeding is with Clover Ridge County Bank. The original agricultural operating loans were through 2 institutions, First National and the USDA Farm Service Agency. Carl pulled something up on his phone. Total outstanding is, but we have the figure from the acquisition assessment. I know what it is, Mason said. I wrote it on a farm last September. He looked up. Contact the county bank and both lending institutions. I want to purchase the debt instruments directly and then satisfy them. Full discharge. No conditions. Carl stared at him. Can you do that? Mason asked. Legally, yes, Carl said slowly. The bank they'll want to know the buyer's intent. The intent is full discharge and title transfer to Ava Harper free and clear, Mason said. No lien, no mortgage, nothing attached. Mason, I know what it is. He looked at Carl steadily. She doesn't find out until it's done. I don't want her to know I'm doing it while I'm doing it. Can you make that happen? Carl was quiet for a moment. I'll need about 2 weeks to work through all 3 institutions. Do it in 10 days. I'll try. Thank you. Carl nodded and went to his phone. Mason looked at the legal pad. He looked at the name he'd written on it the night before. He had not called her. He had not texted. He had nothing to say to her yet that wouldn't sound like a promise he hadn't yet kept, and he didn't make promises before he'd kept them. That was the version of himself he wanted to be. The one who showed her the thing done, not the intention. He thought about how she would find out. He thought about the moment she would understand what he'd done and what it had cost him, and the fact that he'd done it without knowing whether it would change anything between them. He thought about doing it anyway. That was the thing he'd stopped measuring and started knowing. The day was long. He met with Patricia Gaines at 2 p.m. and told her the project was being formally withdrawn. She listened with the composure of someone who has heard many things in this job and processes information the same way regardless of its valence. The county put considerable resources into the approval process, she said. I know, the company will make the county whole on those costs. She looked at him steadily. What about the other landowners? The families who sold? They're not getting their land back. Those were completed arm's-length transactions. The company will offer a supplemental payment to each seller acknowledging the disruption. He paused. It's not a perfect solution. There isn't one. But we're going to do what we can. She was quiet for a moment. And the Harper property? That's being handled separately. She looked at him for a long moment in the way that Patricia Gaines looked at things, like she was reading a document, slowly and carefully, making sure she understood what was actually on the page. All right, she said. He spent the rest of the afternoon in back-to-back calls. His legal team, his communications director, the company's relationship managers for the contractors who'd bid the work. None of the conversations were easy. A few of them were very hard. The contractor who'd won the site prep bid had turned down another project to keep his schedule clear for Clover Ridge, and he said so without raising his voice, which was worse somehow than if he had raised it. Mason listened, acknowledged it, and had his CFO begin the process of compensation the next morning. Sophie called him at 5:30 when she was home from school and he was still in the office. Are you coming home for dinner? She asked. I'm trying, he said. I'm having a big day. What kind of big? He thought about how to explain it to a 6-year-old. The kind where you do something hard that you know you need to do. Did it work? I think so. I won't know for a while. A pause on the line. He could hear her in the background of the apartment, the specific sound of her moving through the kitchen, the cabinet she always opened looking for crackers. Dad? She said. Yeah. Is it about Ava's farm? He was quiet for a moment. Yes. Good, she said simply. No further comment. She found her crackers and the sound changed to the particular satisfied sound of a child who has what she wanted. Grandma says dinner is at 6:30. I'll be there, he said. He was there at 6:45, which was close enough that his mother only looked at him for a second before moving on. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them, pasta his mother had made, which was the same pasta she'd made for him his whole childhood. And Sophie told him about a girl at school who had a rabbit, and could the rabbit come to visit, which required a longer conversation than he had energy for, but he had it anyway, because this was dinner, and dinner mattered. After Sophie was in bed, his mother sat with him at the kitchen table with tea. Eleanor Sterling was 64, careful, and had the specific quality that some people develop late in life of saying exactly what she meant without preamble. You look like you made a big decision, she said. I did. The farm project? He looked at her. How did you... You've been different for months, she said, since that summer. I didn't ask because it wasn't my business. But the way you look tonight is the way you looked when you made the call to restructure the company after your father died. Like something's been set down. Something has, he said. She turned her tea mug in her hands. And the woman? He didn't answer right away. The kitchen was quiet, the apartment settling into its nighttime sounds. I don't know, he said. What I did it because it was right, not because I thought it would fix things between us. She may not want... He stopped. I hurt her. At the meeting, I stood up in front of 300 people and didn't choose her when I should have. You're choosing her now. I'm choosing the right thing, he said carefully, which happens to be the same as choosing her, but I'm not doing it as a transaction. I'm not doing it to get something. His mother looked at him for a long moment. I know that, she said, but you'll need to see it too. I know. She put her hand briefly on his, the way she'd done when he was very small and something was difficult. "Give her time to see it," she said. He nodded. He went to bed and slept better than he had in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, almost nothing was resolved, but because the measuring was over and the thing was in motion, and there's a particular kind of rest that comes from that, even when the outcome is uncertain. The 10 days that followed were the quietest 10 days Mason had spent in years. Quiet in the sense of internal quiet, not literal quiet. The literal situation was anything but, with the project withdrawal generating press coverage and investor calls, and a structured series of very unpleasant financial conversations. The Millhaven Courier ran the story on a Thursday. Sterling Logistics cancels Clover Ridge Valley project. Diane Chu's reporting was thorough and fair as usual. She noted the financial loss to the company, the impact on the county, the status of the Harper farm, and the unresolved question of why. Mason gave one comment. His communications director tried to expand it to a proper statement. He declined. The comment was, "This project was built on an incomplete understanding of what it was asking for. That's my responsibility." That was it. The calls from financial press took the comment and speculated around it for several days. Various analysts had various interpretations. Mason read none of them. Carl was managing the debt acquisition with the 3 lending institutions. It was going to take the full 10 days, and the USDA portion required a step Mason hadn't anticipated, additional paperwork, a designated intermediary, that added 2 days. He worked through it. He came in early and stayed late on those days, which his assistant noted by extending his lunch break without being asked, which he appreciated. He did not contact Ava. He wanted to. Several times a day he wanted to. He picked up his phone and put it down again more times than he could count. He had nothing to say yet that was finished. He was a man who, in 4 years of raising a daughter alone, had learned that actions meant more than intentions, and that telling someone what you planned to do was worth less than showing them what you'd done. He waited. Ava, meanwhile, was learning that life has a way of continuing regardless of what's happening inside it. She was also learning that grief had a specific texture when it was grief for a person still alive, different from the grief for her father, which had been the permanent kind, the one that rewrites the future permanently. This was the removable kind, possibly. She didn't know yet, but it had the same quality of weight in the mornings, the same tendency to be worst in the hour between waking and coffee. She worked. This was what she knew how to do with hard things, and she had plenty of work, and the farm did not care whether she was heartbroken. The chickens needed feeding in the morning, broken or not. Biscuit needed the fence checked. The tractor, running well now, she noticed every time she used it, the smoothness of an engine that had been properly serviced, needed to bring in the north field before the weather changed. She did not reach out to Mason. She had said what she had to say at the town meeting, and she stood by it. She was not the kind of person who walked something back because it was uncomfortable, and what she'd said was true. And she was going to give it the dignity of having been true. If he had something to show her, he knew where she was. She'd been on this farm her whole life. She wasn't hard to find. Linda Kowalski came by on a Wednesday with a casserole and the news about the project cancellation, which Ava had seen in the Courier the day before and had spent a morning sitting with before she felt ready to think about it clearly. "What does it mean for you?" Linda asked. They were on the porch, the casserole on the railing between them, the valley settling into a cool afternoon. "I don't know yet," Ava said honestly. "The foreclosure is still active. The debt is still real. Canceling the project doesn't change my situation with the bank." "But he canceled it," Linda said, with the tone of a woman who has opinions about what this means. "I know he did." "That's not nothing, Ava." "No," she said. "It's not nothing." Linda looked at her with the directness of a woman who has known her since childhood and has no patience for watching her be stubborn about things that matter. "Do you love him?" Ava looked at the upper pasture. The grass was long still. She kept meaning to cut it. "I don't know," she said. "That usually means yes," Linda said. "It means I don't know," Ava said. "I know what I felt. I know I let him in here in a way I haven't let anyone in a very long time. And I know he stood up in front of 300 people and said he hadn't figured it out yet, and I walked out." She paused. I don't regret walking out. That was right, but she stopped. But, Linda said. He might have been telling the truth, Ava said quietly, that he was still working through it, that he hadn't gotten to the answer yet. She looked at the upper pasture. I might have walked out on someone who was 2 days from an answer. Linda was quiet. The valley was cooling down around them, the late afternoon light going golden on the hills. Then wait and see, Linda said. I'm waiting, Ava said. That's all I know how to do right now. She was in the barn on a Thursday, 12 days after the town meeting, doing the kind of organizational work you save for days when you need to do something with your hands without it requiring much thought. She was sorting hardware bins, a genuinely pointless task that she knew was pointless, but the sorting gave her hands something to do and her mind a rest. She was on the third bin when she heard a car on the gravel lane. Not the Land Cruiser. A different car. She could tell by the engine note, which she'd learned without meaning to over the summer. This was something quieter. She heard it pull into the yard and stop. She put the bin down and went to the barn door. It was an unfamiliar car. A sedan, silver, clean, and the person getting out of it was not Mason. It was a woman in her 50s, professional-looking, carrying a briefcase and a manila envelope. Ms. Harper, the woman said. Ava came out of the barn. Yes. My name is Patricia Halsey. I'm an attorney with Sterling Logistics. She said it plainly, no softening of the edges, and Ava immediately felt the old guard go up. The instinctive brace for the next version of the thing she'd been bracing for. I'm here to deliver some documents, and to explain them, if you'd like. What documents? Ava said. The woman held out the manila envelope. Ava looked at it. She looked at the woman. The woman's expression was professional and neutral in the way of someone doing a job they know is significant to the recipient, and they're giving the recipient room to process it. Ava took the envelope. She opened it there, standing in the yard in the mid-morning, the lawyer waiting at a respectful distance, the valley doing its ordinary Thursday things around her. She pulled out the papers. She read the first page. She read it again. She looked up. Is this? She said. She stopped. Her voice wasn't quite right. She cleared it. Is this what I think it is? It's a full debt satisfaction and discharge, the attorney said. The outstanding balances on all 3 of your lending instruments, the county bank foreclosure proceeding, the First National Operating Loan, and the USDA Farm Service Agency loan, have been purchased and satisfied in full by Sterling Logistics. She paused. The title to the property has been updated to reflect the discharge of all liens. The farm is yours, free and clear. Ava was quiet. The papers in her hands were not shaking. Her hands were very still, which was often what happened with her when something very large hit. Not trembling, but stillness, like the body going quiet around an impact. What does he want in return? She said. The attorney met her eyes. Nothing, she said. That was the specific and repeated instruction. Nothing. No conditions. No expectations. No covenants on the land. A pause. He said, I'm paraphrasing, these aren't legal terms, he said that what he owed the land was more than the debt, and this was what he could do. Ava looked at the papers. He also said, the attorney continued and then paused like she was making a decision about whether to include this, that he wanted you to know he did this before knowing what you'd decide. About anything. She paused. Those were his words, before knowing what you'd decide about anything. The valley was very quiet. The oak trees at the corner of the property were moving slightly in the morning air. The east fence was straight and solid. The workshop where she kept her tools organized the way she'd shown him held everything in its place. And in the corner of the barn, a cardboard box with the name Sophie written on it held smooth rocks from the creek bed that a 6-year-old had collected 3 visits in a row because she'd decided this was a place she was planning to come back to. Ava looked at the papers in her hands. She looked at the upper pasture, still long, still empty, waiting. She looked at the attorney, who was doing her job with dignity and giving her space for whatever this moment required. Thank you, Ava said. Her voice was steady. Of course. The attorney gave a small nod. The documents are fully executed. You'll want your own attorney to review them, but they're complete. She picked up her briefcase. Is there anything else I can help you with? Ava looked at the papers one more time. No, she said. I know what I need to do. The attorney drove back down the gravel lane. The mailbox with the barely legible numbers was visible at the end of it, the old oaks along both sides, the lane her family had driven for 3 generations. Ava stood in the yard for a while after the car disappeared. She felt something happening in her chest that was several things at once. Relief so profound, it was almost physical. Grief for the weeks she'd spent carrying what she could put down now. The specific, complicated feeling of receiving something from someone and knowing it was clean, no strings, no performance, just the thing done. He'd canceled the project. Then he'd cleared the debt. Then he'd told his attorney to say, before knowing what you'd decide about anything. That was a man who had done the thing he knew he had to do without using it as leverage. That was the most specific and unmistakable kind of integrity she knew, the kind that doesn't wait to see if it's going to pay off. She went inside. She set the papers on the kitchen table next to the sugar bowl. She looked at the jar of elderberry branches, still there, dried out, still holding their shape in the way dried things do. She stood there for a little while in the kitchen her family had built, and the house her family had kept, and the farm that was hers now in a way it hadn't quite been before. Not because the paper said so, but because the weight of losing it had been so constant for so long that its absence felt like a new dimension in the room, space she hadn't known was missing. She picked up her phone. She looked at Mason's number for a moment. She put the phone in her pocket and went to get her jacket, the green canvas one, the one her father had given her. She went to the barn and checked the box of rocks, which was still there, correctly labeled, exactly where he'd put it. She had been waiting and watching, the same as she'd told Linda, waiting to see what the man did with his answer once he found it. She'd seen it now. She went back inside. She made coffee, strong, the way she always made it. She sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her and the coffee and the dried elderberry branches in the mason jar, and she thought about a road in midsummer, early morning, a flat tire and a stranger who turned out to be the most complicated person she'd ever let close. She thought about what Linda had said. That usually means yes. She thought about the box of rocks. She drank her coffee. Then she picked up her phone and booked a bus ticket to the city. The 8:15 the next morning, arriving at the city central station at 10:30. She didn't book a return because she didn't know yet what the return would look like, and she was done planning for things before she'd seen the shape of them. She packed a small bag, enough for a few days. She left the kitchen light on, the way her father always had when he was expecting someone back. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the valley and thought, tomorrow. That was all. Just the word, just the morning coming, just the thing she was going to do. In the city, 23 floors above the quiet streets, Mason Sterling was sitting at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, looking at a legal pad with a name written at the bottom of it, waiting for what came next. He didn't know when it was coming. He didn't know if it was coming. He had done what he could do and said what he meant and put it out there without a guarantee, which was the only honest way to do it. And also, he was discovering the most difficult way to live with in the short term. He sat there. He drank his cold coffee. He thought about the east fence and the water pump and a morning in September when she'd sat at the northeast corner with her hand on a stone wall her great-grandfather had built, not knowing he was watching. He thought about what it cost to wait. He thought about how it was worth it. He went to bed. The 8:15 bus out of Millhaven was not a comfortable bus. It was the kind of regional carrier that had been making the same run for 20 years, with the same cracked armrests and the same slightly optimistic air conditioning that worked fine in March, and gave up entirely by August. In late September, it was somewhere in between, cool enough in fits, warm in the back rows, smelling of vinyl and old coffee, and the particular patience of people who travel by bus, because it's what they can afford or because they have no reason to hurry. Ava sat in the fourth row with her bag on her lap and watched Millhaven disappear behind the tree line, and then the valley, and then the low country between Clover Ridge and the highway. She watched it go the way you watch things when you're not sure what they'll look like when you come back to them. Not changed, probably. The land didn't change that fast, but you changed sometimes, and that made the same land look different. She hadn't told Mason she was coming. She'd thought about it on the bus platform, phone in hand, and decided against it. What she needed to see was him as he actually was. Not prepared, not arranged, not the version of himself he could assemble given warning. She'd been seeing the prepared version of Mason Sterling in some form since the beginning. The careful voice, and the measured answers, and the notes he'd folded up and put in his jacket pocket at the town meeting. She needed the unguarded version. The version she'd gotten on the Route 9 shoulder and at the kitchen table and on the east fence. The version that showed up when he wasn't expecting to be seen. She also needed to say something she'd been working on for 12 days, and she needed to say it before she knew how he'd respond, because that was the only way it would be honest. The bus got into the city at 10:47, which was 12 minutes late, which was about standard. She took a cab from the station. She had Mason's business address from a card he'd left on the kitchen table weeks ago. She'd kept it in the kitchen drawer without fully admitting to herself why. And she gave it to the driver and watched the city go past the window in its morning busy way, the density of it after weeks in the valley, the noise and motion of a place that didn't have quiet hours. Sterling Logistics occupied 3 floors of a glass building on the north side of downtown. The lobby was the kind of lobby that communicated competence without trying too hard. Clean lines, good materials, a reception desk staffed by a young man who looked up when she came in with the professional attention of someone trained to assess visitors quickly. "I'm here to see Mason Sterling," she said. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Your name?" "Ava Harper." The receptionist typed something, looked at his screen, and then looked up with an expression that had shifted very slightly. The specific shift of someone who has just recognized a name they've heard in a context that gave it weight. "One moment," he said, and picked up his phone. She stood in the lobby. She was still in her good boots and the green canvas jacket, and she was aware that she looked like what she was, a woman from a farm who had taken the morning bus to the city. And she did not particularly care about this. The receptionist hung up. "I'll take you up," he said. 22 floors. She'd known he worked high up. The view from his windows had come up once, briefly, in a conversation about the city. She hadn't imagined it specifically, but when the elevator opened into the reception area of the executive floor, she could see the city through the glass walls, spread out in every direction, and she understood something about the life he operated in that she hadn't fully understood before. Not in a way that impressed her exactly. She was not easily impressed by altitude, but in a way that helped her see the distance between his ordinary and hers, and how far he'd come down, repeatedly, to stand in a barn with a wrench. His assistant, a woman around 40, efficient, with the kind of face that held things without leaking them, came to meet her. "Ms. Harper," she said, "I'll let him know you're here. He's just finishing a call." "Take your time," Ava said. She sat in one of the chairs by the window and looked at the city and thought about nothing specific, which was a skill she'd developed on the farm, the ability to be in a place without demanding the place do anything for you. You stood in the field and let the field be a field. You sat in the waiting area and let it be a waiting area. She heard a door open down the hall. She heard him before she saw him. A voice, his voice, saying something brief to his assistant, and then a pause, and then his assistant saying something back, and then footsteps. He came around the corner and stopped. She stood up. They looked at each other across the reception area, and neither of them said anything for a moment. He was in a dress shirt and slacks. The work version of him, the boardroom version, the version she'd known existed but rarely seen, and he had the look of someone who had not slept very well in a couple of weeks and wasn't trying to hide it. His expression when he saw her was not the prepared kind. It was the kind you get when something you've been waiting for appears before you're ready, and readiness turns out not to matter. "You came," he said. "I came," she said. A pause. "How long have you been in the city?" "About 40 minutes. "You took the bus." "It's what I take." He looked at her. She could see him deciding something, the same decision she'd seen him make before. The careful version or the real one. "Do you want to go somewhere?" he said. "Not here. Somewhere we can actually talk." "Yes," she said. They went to a diner 4 blocks from his building, which surprised her. She'd expected somewhere more consistent with the 22nd floor, But she understood it when they got there. It was a real diner, the kind with laminate countertops and coffee and thick mugs, the kind that had been in the same spot for decades and had no interest in being anything other than what it was. The kind of place you went when you needed a conversation that couldn't be decorated away. They sat in a booth near the back. The coffee arrived without being asked for. It was not strong enough. She could tell immediately, but she drank it anyway. "I read the documents," she said. "I know," he said. "Your attorney told you." "She let me know you'd received them, not what you'd said, just that." Ava wrapped her hands around the mug. "You cleared the debt," she said. "Yes." "And the project?" "Gone," he said. "Formally withdrawn 3 weeks ago. The county has the notification. The investor settlement is in process." He paused. "It cost a lot." "I know it did," she said. "That's why I'm here." He looked at her. "I need to say something before you say anything," she said, "because I've been carrying it for 12 days and it needs to come out first, before whatever else we say." He put his coffee down and gave her the full attention he gave things when they mattered. She'd learned to recognize that quality in him, the way he went still and present when something required it, no part of him somewhere else. "At the town meeting," she said, "I told you that you hadn't chosen, and that was true. You hadn't, not yet, but I walked out without giving you the room to get there." She held his look. "I've been thinking about what my dad would say about that. He'd say I was right to say what I said, and he'd also say that I've always had a tendency to draw a conclusion before the evidence is finished." She paused. "You were working through something real. The fact that you hadn't gotten to the answer yet didn't mean you weren't going to get there, and I didn't give you that." Mason was quiet. "I'm not saying I was wrong to leave," she said. "I wasn't wrong. What I felt was real and what I said was true. But I've been sitting with the part that wasn't generous, and that part belongs to me." She looked at her coffee. "So, that's what I needed to say first." He didn't answer right away. She'd half expected him to say you don't need to apologize, or some version of that, the reflex of people who are uncomfortable receiving accountability. He didn't do that. He sat with what she'd said the way he sat with things that deserved sitting with. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saying that." "Don't make it too large," she said. "It's just the truth." "I know, but thank you anyway." He picked up his coffee. "I need to say something too." "Okay." "I should have told you the full picture from the beginning," he said. "Not at the first meeting. I couldn't have known then what any of this would become. But by the time I was coming out to the farm every week, by the time Sophie had a box of rocks in your barn, by then I knew something real was happening, and I kept not telling you the full shape of what I was carrying, and that wasn't fair to you." He paused. "You made decisions about how much to trust me without the complete information. That's on me." She looked at him. "It is," she said simply. "But you told me when I asked you directly." "Eventually." "You told me the truth when it counted," she said. "That matters more than the timing." "You're being generous." "I'm being accurate," she said. "There's a difference. I know the difference." He smiled at that. Not a full smile, something smaller, the kind that happens when someone says the thing that cuts right to it. She'd made him smile like that before. On the east fence, at lunch, in the barn. It was one of the things she'd let herself notice. "Why did you do it?" she said. "The debt, not the project cancellation. I understand that, I think, but the debt." He looked at her steadily. "Because the project being gone didn't fix what the project had created," he said. "Your family spent generations building something, and my company's plans put you under a specific financial pressure that you wouldn't have been under otherwise. The bank was moving because the foreclosure timeline aligned with our acquisition strategy. That's not entirely my fault. The debt predated me. But I accelerated the timeline. I owed the land something for that." He paused. "And because I couldn't put right what had been taken from the other families in the valley, those were completed sales, fair transactions, I can't undo them. But I could put right this one thing, fully, and I did." "Your attorney said you did it before knowing what I'd decide," Ava said. "About anything?" "Yes." "That was important to me," she said, "that it wasn't a trade." "I know it was. That's why I did it that way." She looked at him for a long moment. The diner was doing its mid-morning business around them. A few people at the counter, a couple at a table near the front, the ordinary rhythms of a place that had no interest in their conversation. She'd been here 40 minutes, and she'd already said the two things she'd come to say, and what was left was everything that came after them. "So," she said. "So," he said. "Here's where I am," she said. "You did something real. You did it the right way, before knowing if it would matter to me, without conditions, without performing it. That tells me something about who you're trying to be." She paused. "And I've been thinking about who I'm trying to be. I'm someone who stopped for a stranger on Route 9 because my father taught me that you stop. I'm someone who plants flowers in window boxes when she's drowning in debt, because the debt is one thing and the flowers are another thing, and they don't cancel each other out." She looked at her coffee. "And I'm someone who let herself care about a person even when it was complicated, even when the situation said she probably shouldn't, and who walked away when she felt betrayed and spent 3 weeks in the kind of quiet that tells you something true about what's missing." She looked up. "I don't want to go back to what it was before," she said. "I don't want the careful version of you that keeps all options open. I don't want something tentative and managed." She held his look. "But I don't want to rush into something that hasn't earned its own ground yet either. We've spent 3 months on a farm that had a crisis around it. That's not the same as knowing someone in ordinary time." "No," he said, "it's not. So I think—" She stopped, tried again. "I think what I want is to find out what it looks like when the crisis is over. What you're like when you're not renovating my fence or proving something. What I'm like when I'm not fighting to keep my land." She paused. "I think I want to see if what we have holds up in ordinary time." He was quiet for a moment. "That's reasonable," he said. "I know it is. I'm a reasonable person." "I know you are. I'm also—" She stopped. This part was harder, not because it wasn't true, but because it was true in a way that made her feel exposed, and she didn't love feeling exposed, even when she knew it was necessary. "I'm also someone who has not let anyone this close in a very long time, and the last time I did, it ended badly, so I go slowly. I always have." She looked at him. "I need you to know that and mean it when you say you can work with it." "I can work with it," he said, and then, "I've had 4 years of not letting anyone close either. I know what that looks like. I know how it becomes a habit that starts to feel like a preference." He paused. "Sophie asked me a few weeks ago why I don't have someone. She's 6. She doesn't dress it up. She just asked, 'Why don't you have someone, Dad?'" He looked at his coffee. "I didn't have a good answer, which means the answer was probably that I'd been choosing not to." "And now?" Ava said. "Now I'm choosing differently," he said, "slowly, on whatever ground earns itself." He looked up. "I'm good at patience when I understand what I'm being patient for." She held his look. "Okay," she said, and this time the word had its fullest meaning. Not "I've noted what you said," not "I'm watching to see what you do with it," not the hanging by a thread version from the barn. This was the word as full acceptance, as opening, as the thing that comes after all the other things have been said, and there's nothing left but yes. He heard the difference. She could tell he heard it. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. Not a grand gesture, not something that required narrating, just his hand on hers, on the laminate countertop of a diner 4 blocks from his office, in the ordinary mid-morning light. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat there for a while. The coffee went cold. Neither of them moved to fix it. There's a thing that happens sometimes when you've been holding something tightly for a very long time and you finally put it down. Not immediately. It takes a while for your body to understand that the weight is gone. You keep the posture of carrying even after your hands are empty. You brace for a load that isn't there. Ava had been bracing since her father died. She'd been bracing against the debt, and the bank, and the project, and the grief, and the loneliness of doing it all alone. And she'd been bracing against Mason Sterling specifically since the day she understood what he represented. The bracing had become her default, her resting state, the particular set of her shoulders and her jaw that she carried into every day. Sitting in the diner with his hand over hers, she felt something in that posture begin, not to dissolve, not all at once, Not like the movies where transformation is instant and complete. It began to ease. Like a muscle that has been contracted so long it's forgotten the other state, and then remembers. It was going to take time, she knew that. Time and ordinary days and the accumulation of small moments that weren't a crisis, weren't a test, weren't anything except two people being themselves in the same space. She was not a person who trusted transformation that happened overnight. She didn't trust instant things. She trusted the slow building kind, the kind like fence posts, properly set, that hold through seasons. But this was a beginning. She recognized beginnings. He took her to get lunch after the diner, a real lunch, unhurried, and they talked the way they hadn't quite been able to at the farm, with the crisis always in the background. They talked about things that didn't matter and things that did. She told him about her one semester of agricultural science before she'd transferred to the state school and then eventually come home. He told her about the years after his father died, the specific loneliness of inheriting something before you were ready for it, the way responsibility can feel like grief's less sympathetic cousin. She told him about her mother, who she didn't talk about often, who had left when Ava was 7, for reasons that were complicated and not entirely anyone's fault, and had nonetheless left a particular shape in her understanding of what staying meant. He didn't say "I'm sorry" in the automatic way. He said, "So you learned early that some people leave?" And she said yes, and he said, "And you learned to be the one who stays?" And she said yes again, and he was quiet for a moment and then said, "I learned that too, after Sophie's mother." They stayed through the afternoon. He called his assistant at 2 o'clock and rescheduled what was left of his day without explanation. Ava noticed this and didn't say anything about it because she'd learned that Mason's silences and what he did with his time were more telling than what he announced. And what he was announcing without words right now was that this afternoon was more important than the rest of it. Sophie got out of school at 3:15. This came up because his phone buzzed with a reminder, and he looked at it, and Ava said, "What is it?" And he said, "Sophie's school pickup." And she said, "Then go get her." And he looked at her and she looked back and said, "I'd like to meet her again, properly. Not as your daughter who came to the farm, as Sophie." He looked at her for a moment. "She's already met you," he said. "She already has opinions about you." "I know she does," Ava said, "but I'd like her to meet the version of me that knows what I'm doing here." They picked up Sophie together. Sophie came out of the school building in a cluster of children that broke apart at the gate, each child peeling toward their person. And when she saw her father, she ran, the way children run, without self-consciousness, without managing the impression, just running because running was the right speed for this. She hit him mid-torso and he caught her and she said, "You're early," with the accusation of someone who takes schedules seriously. "I had a good reason," he said. Sophie looked past him. She saw Ava. The expression that moved through her face was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition. The look of someone seeing a thing they'd been thinking about for a while finally appear in front of them. She was 6. She didn't manage her expressions yet, and the expression said clearly, "Oh, you came." "Hi, Ava," she said. "Hi, Sophie," Ava said. "Did you come to see Dad?" "I did." Sophie considered this with the seriousness she brought to important things. "Are you staying for dinner?" Ava looked at Mason. He looked back at her with an expression that said, "I'm not answering that one first." "If that's okay with you," Ava said to Sophie. "It's okay with me," Sophie said immediately, like the question was almost too easy. She took Ava's hand, just reached up and took it, the way children take hands when the decision has already been made and the formalities are just catching up, and started walking toward the car. "We have to stop and get bread because Dad forgot to buy bread again." "I didn't forget," Mason said, falling into step beside them. "I just didn't prioritize it." "That's the same as forgetting," Sophie said. "It really isn't." "It is," Sophie said to Ava. "He does this." "I can see that," Ava said. Mason made a sound that was not quite a word. Ava was fighting a smile and mostly losing. They stopped and got bread. Dinner that night was not fancy. Mason's mother was not there. Just the 3 of them in his apartment kitchen, which was large and well-equipped and had clearly been cooked in very little. Ava made pasta because she knew how, and Mason helped prep in the way he'd learned at the farm. Methodical, watching for what needed doing, not improvising. Sophie sat at the counter and provided running commentary on school events, a complex social situation involving a boy named Declan who had said something about her drawing, and her ongoing research into whether goats could be kept in city apartments, which she presented as genuine inquiry. "They can't," Mason said. "I didn't say they should," Sophie said. "I said I was researching." "What have you found?" Ava asked, because she was genuinely curious what a 6-year-old's research process looked like. "They need grass," Sophie said, "and space, and they're happier outside." She paused. "So they'd have to be farm goats." "That's correct," Ava said. Sophie looked at her with the specific expression she used when she'd maneuvered a conversation to where she wanted it. "Biscuit would be happy at the farm," she said, "because she's already there." "She would," Ava agreed, "and we could visit her." "You could." Sophie nodded, satisfied. She picked up her fork. The matter was settled, in Sophie's world, at whatever level she'd been working it at. Ava looked at Mason, who was looking at his daughter with the particular kind of worn-out parental love that is actually not worn out at all, just practiced in looking that way. After dinner, after Sophie had been convinced to go to bed through a negotiation involving 2 books, and the firm establishment that 11 more minutes of reading light was the final offer, Mason and Ava sat on the couch in his living room with the city visible through the big windows. It was fully dark outside. The city at night from up here was its own kind of landscape. Not the same as the valley, not better or worse, just a different scale of human effort visible all at once. "She's exactly who she seems to be," Ava said. "She has no second gears," Mason said. "Whatever she is, that's what she is. I used to worry about that. Now I think it's probably the healthiest thing about either of us." Ava looked at him. "She's going to be someone difficult and wonderful to know." "Already is," he said. She smiled at that. Then the smile settled into something quieter. "I have to go back tomorrow," she said. "The farm doesn't keep itself." "I know. And I need—" She paused. "I need to spend some time with it just being mine, without the debt, without the threat." She looked at him. "I've never known it that way. I took it over the way you take over a sinking thing. I want to know it when it's just a farm. I want to walk the property line and not be counting what I'm going to lose." "That makes sense," he said. "It means I need a few weeks," she said, "before we try to figure out what ordinary time looks like." "Take what you need," he said. "I'm not asking for space," she said carefully. "I know people use that word as a way to start disappearing. That's not what I mean." "I know," he said. "You mean exactly what you said." "Yes," she said. "I do." They were quiet for a while. The city went on outside the windows, indifferent to everything. "I'm going to ask you something," he said after a while, "and you don't have to answer tonight." "Okay." Sterling Logistics, when it restructures, it's going to be smaller, more regionally focused, more the kind of company my father would have recognized. He paused. "One of the things I've been thinking about is a regional agricultural logistics operation. Small scale, direct relationships with farms in the valley. The kind of thing that supports what's already there instead of replacing it." He looked at her. "I don't know if it's viable. I don't know if the farms that are left would want it. I'm not asking you to be involved. That's not the question." "What's the question?" she said. "Would it bother you?" he said carefully. "If I was in the valley for reasons that weren't just you? If I was trying to build something there that was its own thing?" She looked at him for a moment. She understood the question. He was asking whether he could be a person in her world who had his own reasons for being there, not just her reasons, not just following her into a space she occupied. He was asking to belong to the valley on his own terms, the same way she belonged to it. "No," she said. "It wouldn't bother me." "Okay," he said. "It would actually—" She stopped, started again. "It would actually make me trust it more," she said. "If you have your own reasons for being there. People who are only there for you will leave when things get complicated. People who have their own stake, their own reasons, they stay." He looked at her. "My mother left because she didn't have her own reasons for being on the farm," Ava said. "She was only there because of my father, and when that stopped being enough, she went." She paused. "So, yes, have your own reasons." "I will," he said. She left his apartment at 10 o'clock. He called her a car. She took the hotel she'd looked up earlier, a modest place near the bus station, nothing that would make her feel like a guest in someone else's life. And in the morning, she took the 8:15 back to Millhaven. The bus was the same bus, the same cracked armrests, the same fitful air. She sat in the fourth row and watched the city become highway, become low country, become the familiar turnoff for the valley road. She was home by 11. The house smelled like old wood and the memory of motor oil and the specific quiet of a place that has been waiting for you. She set her bag down in the kitchen. She made coffee. She stood at the window and looked at the yard. The east fence straight and solid, the barn with its properly secured roof, the workshop where the tools were organized and the tractor ran smooth. She looked at the papers on the kitchen table next to the sugar bowl, the discharge documents, her name on them. The land hers, the way it had always been hers in meaning and was now hers in fact, unencumbered, clear. She picked up her jacket and went outside. She walked the property line. She started at the gatepost and went clockwise the way she always had, and she went slowly because there was no reason to hurry and she wanted to take it in at the speed it deserved. The east fence first, new posts holding clean, the wire with the right tension. Around the northeast corner to the old stone wall where the fieldstone marker sat under the big oak, unmoved, unconcerned with everything that had happened and nearly happened. She put her hand on the marker the way she put her hand on the stones of the wall, the cold, solid permanence of it, the way old things hold. "Hey, Grandpa," she said. She always said it. She'd feel foolish about it, except that she'd never felt foolish about it, and she wasn't going to start. She kept walking. The south field with its corrected drainage, the low spot that no longer held water for days. The upper pasture, still long, still empty. She was going to put cattle back up there. Not immediately, the finances needed a full season to find their own level first, but in the spring. She was going to put cattle on that upper pasture and watch them move through it the way her father had watched his, the specific satisfaction of an animal at ease in the place it belongs. She came back around to the farmhouse and stood in the yard. It was hers, the whole 63 acres of it, the stones and the fence posts and the tractor and the barn with the box of rocks in the corner, hers the way her father had meant to give it to her, without the debt in front of it. She stood there in the October morning and felt, for the first time in a year and a half, what it felt like to stand on her own ground without bracing. The weeks that followed were the first ordinary weeks she'd had in longer than she could accurately remember. No crisis, no counting down, just the farm doing what farms do in fall, the preparation work, the equipment winterization, the last of the season's tasks before the land went into its rest. She fixed things that had been on the list for months and didn't fix some that could wait, because that was also part of ordinary life, the judgment call of what now and what later, made without emergency driving the answer. Mason came out on a Saturday in late October. Just one day. He had Sophie, so they both came, Sophie in her farm boots and the backpack. The day was cool and clear, one of those fall days that the valley did particularly well, the trees fully turned, the light coming in at an angle that made the hills look like something out of a painting that was trying not to be too obvious about it. He helped with the winterization of the irrigation system. Sophie helped with the chickens, which the chickens tolerated with varying degrees of cooperation. They ate lunch on the porch instead of the tailgate because it was cold enough to want to sit out of the wind. And Sophie produced from her backpack a drawing she'd made, a new one, the farm from above, bird's eye view, with labels in her careful 6-year-old handwriting: barn, fence, biscuit, house, tree, grandpa. That last one made Ava go still. "Sophie," Mason said, a note of caution in his voice. "I asked Ava about it before," Sophie said, not defensive but clear. "She told me about her grandpa in the corner. She said he liked it there because you could see the whole valley from the oak." She looked at Ava. "So I put him in." Ava looked at the drawing. The tree in the northeast corner, labeled Tree, Grandpa, with the small square of the fieldstone marker drawn in with the particular earnestness of a child trying to get something right. "You got the oak right," she said. "The shape of it." "I looked at it a lot," Sophie said. Ava took the drawing. She looked at it for a moment, The whole farm laid out in Sophie's handwriting, everything labeled, everything in its place. "Can I keep this one too?" she said. Sophie nodded like this was always the plan. They put it on the refrigerator next to the first one. Two drawings now side by side, the close-up portrait of Biscuit with the precisely right eyes, and the bird's-eye view of the whole farm with everything labeled, and the grandfather's tree in the corner. The refrigerator was beginning to look like someone's home. Mason stayed past dark that Saturday. Sophie fell asleep on the couch under the old quilt that had been Ava's father's, her library book open on her chest. Biscuit's successor drawing held loosely in one hand. They left her there and sat on the porch in the cold, both of them in jackets, with tea that had gone lukewarm. The valley was very dark beyond the yard lights, the hills just shapes against the sky, the stars doing what they did out here away from the city. "I put out feelers on the agricultural logistics idea," he said after a while. "And? 2 farms in the valley are interested, Kowalski and a place called Drummond, family that sold the north parcel but kept the home farm." He turned his mug in his hands. "It's small. It would be operating at a scale my company hasn't worked at in years. Is that a problem?" He thought about it. "No," he said. "I think it's actually what I want. Something I can put my hands on." She looked at him sideways. "You like putting your hands on things," she said. "I've noticed." "I didn't used to," he said. "I used to be entirely comfortable in the abstract. Projections, plans, systems. Things that happened at a remove." He paused. "I think I lost something when I got good at the abstract. The part of the work that tells you what you're doing it for." "The east fence," she said. He looked at her. "That's what told me," she said. "Not anything you said. The fence. The fact that you showed up and did it badly and kept doing it." She looked at the dark hills. "My father used to say you could tell a person's character by watching them do something they're not good at. Easy things don't tell you anything. Hard things do." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you see?" "Someone who doesn't quit," she said, "and someone who doesn't do things for the credit. You could have hired someone to fix my fence. It would have been 1/10 of the effort." She paused. "But you came and did it yourself and made a mess of it and got better, and you didn't make me feel like you were doing me a favor." "I wasn't," he said. "I was doing something I needed." "I know," she said. "That's what made it honest." They sat in the dark for a while. It wasn't perfect. None of this was perfect. He still had a company to restructure and a financial loss to work through and a daughter who asked questions faster than he could answer them. She still had a farm that needed more work than one person could do and a set of habits built for solitude that were going to take time to revise. They were 2 people at the beginning of something, and beginnings are not the same as certainties, and pretending otherwise was the thing she'd sworn off long ago. But the east fence was solid. The water pump ran clean. The tractor had been properly serviced. And somewhere inside the barn, in the corner near Biscuit's pasture, a box with a child's name on it held smooth rocks from the creek bed, collected 3 visits in a row, because the person who collected them had decided, at 6 years old, with the absolute confidence of someone who doesn't yet know how to hedge, that this was a place she was coming back to. Some things, without needing to be taught. 1 year later, almost to the week, Ava was driving on Route 9 in the early morning. She was heading into Millhaven for a delivery pickup, the first small contract from Mason's agricultural logistics operation, which had signed its 3rd farm client the month before and was running 3 trucks now. Nothing like the Empire Sterling Logistics had been at its height and exactly the right size for what it was trying to do. She was going to pick up supplies for the upper pasture, which had 4 cattle on it now, moved in that spring, and the sight of them grazing up there had made her stand at the fence for a good 10 minutes the first morning, not doing anything, just watching. The morning was clear and cold, early October again, the valley in its best season. She almost missed the car. A gray sedan pulled onto the shoulder with its hazards blinking in the stretch of Route 9 where the signal dropped. She knew the spot. She knew it exactly. She pulled over without deciding to. She just pulled over because her father had taught her to stop, and she had always stopped, and this was not the kind of habit you reconsider just because you already know how the story goes. She got out. The morning air was sharp and smelled like the season change, which meant home. The driver was a woman, around 60, in a hatchback, looking at her phone the way people look at their phone, when they know it can't help them, but they keep trying. "You're in the dead zone," Ava said. "No signal for another 8 miles. What's the problem?" "Flat tire," the woman said, with the expression of someone whose morning has gone wrong in a way they weren't prepared for. I've never changed one." "That's all right," Ava said. "I have. Pop your trunk." She got the jack from her truck. She assessed the situation. Rear passenger, clean puncture, looked like a nail, the same as the first time, the same road, the same flat morning light. She got to work. The woman watched her. After a moment, she said, "Do you live out here?" "Down the valley," Ava said. "I've got a farm." "By yourself?" Ava thought about this. She thought about a man who drove a tractor to Millhaven at the speed of commitment and rescheduled his afternoon without explanation and picked up his daughter from school knowing what kind of day that was. She thought about a 6-year-old who labeled a fieldstone marker on a bird's eye drawing with the quiet authority of someone staking a claim. She thought about a Saturday 2 weeks ago when she'd woken early and found Mason already in the kitchen making coffee and not doing a very good job of it. And she'd taken over and he'd leaned against the counter and watched with the expression of someone who had nowhere else to be and knew it. "Not by myself," she said. She got the spare on. She tightened the lug nuts in the star pattern. She lowered the jack and stood up and dusted her hands on her jeans. The woman said, "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," Ava said. "Please, I'd like to—" "My father raised me to stop," Ava said. "It doesn't cost anything." She packed her equipment. She got back in her truck. She thought for just a moment about the morning she'd done this the first time. The black Mercedes on the shoulder, the man with his sleeves rolled up, who turned out to be the most complicated and most honest person she'd ever let into her life. She thought about how a single ordinary thing, a tire on a forgotten road, a stranger stopped for, a refusal of money and then a drive away without looking back, had been the first link in a chain she couldn't have anticipated and wouldn't trade. There was something worth knowing in that. Not a lesson exactly. Life was too complicated for most things to be lessons. But something closer to a fact about how things work, how one thread runs through time and keeps arriving at unexpected places. You stop for a stranger because your father taught you to. You refuse the money because you mean it. You drive away. And somewhere on the other side of that ordinary act, something begins that neither of you can see from the road. She pulled back onto Route 9 and drove toward Millhaven in the October morning. In the upper pasture of the Harper farm, 4 cattle moved through the long grass in the early light, unhurried, each one casting a long shadow in the low sun. The east fence held solid around them. New posts, properly set, wire at the right tension. The kind of work that would hold through seasons without needing attention. And in the northeast corner, under the big oak that was just beginning to turn gold, a fieldstone marker sat exactly where it had always been, patient and permanent, while the whole valley went on around it, changed and unchanged, the way valleys do.